Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Thaddeus Merriweather's hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel, but it wasn't from the cold. The cab heater was running almost too hot, pushing dry air through the vents until his eyes felt gritty and sore. He'd been driving since dawn, hauling a load of mining equipment from Billings eastward toward Bozeman, and the November sky had been threatening snow for the past 100 miles. Now, as he climbed into the mountains along Interstate 90, that threat was becoming a reality. Fat, white flakes were starting to drift down through the beam of his headlights, and the temperature gauge on his dashboard read 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Thad had driven Bozeman Pass more times than he could count over his 15 years behind the wheel. He knew every curve, every grade, every mile marker between Livingston and Bozeman. The pass wasn't particularly high by Montana standards, just over 6,000 feet, but it could be treacherous in winter. The combination of elevation, wind funneling through the gap in the mountains, and sudden temperature drops created conditions that could turn deadly in minutes. Black ice was the worst of it. That invisible layer of frozen moisture that formed on the pavement without warning, so thin you couldn't see it until your tires were already sliding across it, and by then it was usually too late to do anything but pray. The CB radio crackled with static, then a voice broke through. Eastbound traffic on I-90 approaching Bozeman Pass. Be advised we're getting reports of slick conditions near mile marker 274. A couple of four-wheelers went off the road about 20 minutes ago. State Patrol's on scene, but they're recommending chains or pulling over until the plows get through. The voice belonged to another trucker. Probably someone who'd already passed the trouble spot and was giving the standard courtesy warning. Thad keyed his mic and acknowledged, then checked his mirror to see if anyone was following close behind him. The highway was nearly empty, just a few sets of taillights disappearing into the gathering snow behind him. Mile marker 274 was still about 8 miles ahead, which gave him time to think. He could pull over at the next exit and wait out the storm, but that would put him hours behind schedule. The mining company in Bozeman needed this equipment by morning, and they were paying premium rates for the expedited delivery. On the other hand, no amount of money was worth sliding off a mountain road in a 70,000-pound rig. Thad had seen too many wrecks over the years, too many trucks crumpled at the bottom of ravines to take winter driving lightly. He eased off the accelerator slightly, bringing his speed down from 60 to 50, then to 45. The engine downshifted with a low growl, and he felt the Jake brake kick in to help control his speed on the grade. The snow was falling harder now, building up on his windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Visibility was dropping quickly, the world beyond his headlights reduced to a swirling white void. Thad turned up the defroster and leaned forward, squinting through the glass at the road ahead. The pavement looked wet, but not icy, the tires still gripping normally as he navigated the gentle curves. Maybe the reports were exaggerated, he thought. Maybe the worst of it was behind him, and he'd make it through without incident. But even as the thought formed, he felt something change. The truck's handling subtly shifted, the steering becoming just a fraction lighter, the wheels responding to his inputs with a delayed, floating sensation that made his stomach clench. Black ice. He was on it now, that deadly invisible film that turned asphalt into glass. Thad's training took over immediately. He kept his movements smooth and minimal, no sudden corrections, no heavy braking. The truck drifted slightly toward the center line and he turned the wheel gently to compensate, feeling the tires slip and catch. Slip and catch. His heart was hammering, but his breathing stayed controlled. This was manageable. He'd driven through worse. The key was to stay calm, maintain momentum, and ride it out until he reached a section of road with better traction. Then he saw the lights. Red and blue strobes cutting through the snow ahead, the unmistakable pattern of emergency vehicles. Thad's first thought was relief. The state patrol was already on scene, probably directing traffic around whatever accident had occurred. But as he got closer, something about the scene didn't look right. The emergency lights were positioned strangely, some on the right shoulder, others in the median, and one set appeared to be in the middle of the eastbound lanes. He couldn't see any vehicles except for what looked like a single patrol car, and there were no flares or warning triangles set out, no trooper directing traffic. The CB crackled again, but this time the voice was different, distorted, barely audible through waves of static. Eastbound, mile 274, watch for crossing lanes. The transmission broke up completely, leaving only white noise. Thad frowned and reached for the microphone. "Say again, I didn't copy. You're breaking up pretty bad." No response. He tried again, but the CB had gone completely silent except for a low hum that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He smacked the side of the radio with his palm, a gesture that never actually fixed anything but made him feel like he was doing something. The hum continued, unchanged. He was almost at the emergency lights now, close enough to see that they were indeed from a state patrol vehicle, a white Ford Explorer with Montana State Patrol markings. But the vehicle looked wrong somehow. It was positioned at an odd angle across the shoulder and part of the right lane, and as his headlights swept over it, Thad could see that the driver's side was completely caved in, the door crumpled like aluminum foil. The windows were shattered, glittering fragments of safety glass scattered across the pavement. But there was no trooper visible, no ambulance, no tow truck, just the wrecked patrol car sitting there in the falling snow with its lights still flashing. Thad's foot moved toward the brake, then stopped. Touching the brakes on black ice could send him into a spin, and the last thing he needed was to add his rig to whatever disaster had already happened here. He let the truck slow naturally, using the engine compression to reduce his speed as he tried to process what he was seeing. The patrol car looked like it had been hit hard, T-boned by something large and heavy, but there was no other vehicle visible, no debris field, nothing to indicate what had struck it. Just the wreck itself, sitting alone in the snow. As he crept past the patrol car, Thad's headlights illuminated something else. Tracks in the snow, fresh ones, cutting diagonally across both eastbound lanes from the median to the right shoulder. They weren't tire tracks, not exactly. They were more like grooves, two parallel lines about 6 feet apart, as if something heavy had been dragged or had slid across the highway. But the pattern didn't make sense. The grooves were too uniform, too straight, and they crossed the patrol car's position without deviation, as if whatever made them had simply passed through the vehicle rather than colliding with it. The CB suddenly erupted with sound, making Thad jump. But it wasn't a voice. It was a tone. A single sustained note, high and piercing, that made his teeth ache. He reached for the volume knob to turn it down, but before his fingers touched it, the tone cut off and was replaced by that same distorted voice he'd heard earlier. Mile marker 274, November 8th, 11:47 p.m., eastbound collision, multiple vehicles, black ice conditions. The voice was reading what sounded like an accident report, but the date was wrong. Today was November 8th, but it was only 9:30 p.m. according to his dashboard clock. And the voice kept repeating the same information over and over, like a recording stuck in a loop. Thad grabbed his phone from the cup holder and tried to dial 911, but there was no signal. He was in the mountains, in a storm, and the nearest cell tower was probably miles away. He looked in his mirrors and saw that the patrol car's lights were fading into the snow behind him, the red and blue strobes growing dimmer until they disappeared completely. He was alone on the highway now, just him and the truck and the falling snow, and that voice on the CB radio droning on about an accident that hadn't happened yet. He tried to convince himself that he was misunderstanding the situation. Maybe the patrol car had been there for hours, and he just hadn't heard about it. Maybe the CB transmission was coming from somewhere else, bouncing off the mountains in a way that made it sound distorted and strange. Maybe the tracks in the snow were from a previous accident that had already been cleared away. There were logical explanations for everything if he just thought it through. But the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Something was wrong here. Wrong in a way that went beyond bad weather and icy roads. The truck was still sliding more than rolling now, the black ice creating a frictionless surface that made steering almost useless. Thad could feel himself drifting towards the right shoulder, the trailer pushing him sideways despite his attempts to correct. He needed to find a place to pull over, to wait out the storm and the ice and whatever else was happening on this stretch of highway. But the shoulder was narrow and uneven, dropping off sharply on the right side into darkness. If he pulled over too far, he risked tipping the whole rig down the embankment. Mile marker 275 passed by on his right, barely visible through the snow. 1 mile past the patrol car. The CB was still broadcasting that looping message, the voice mechanical and emotionless. Mile marker 274, November 8th, 11:47 p.m. Thad reached over and switched the radio to channel 17, hoping to escape the strange transmission. Silence. He tried channel 9, the emergency channel. More silence. When he switched back to channel 19, the voice was still there, still repeating the same information as if he'd never left. Then he saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, clearly visible in the fresh snow on the right shoulder of the highway. They appeared suddenly as if someone had stepped out of thin air onto the pavement, and they ran parallel to the road for about 50 yards before angling off toward the median. Thad's headlights tracked them as he passed, and he could see that they were fresh, the edges still sharp and defined. But that made no sense. He'd just passed this section of highway seconds ago and there had been no one there. No one walking. No stranded motorist. Nothing. Yet, here were the prints, clear as day. He was about to key the CB microphone to ask if anyone else was seeing this when his headlights caught something in the median. A figure, standing motionless in the center of the grass strip that divided the eastbound and westbound lanes. It was too far away, and the snow was too heavy to make out details, but the shape was unmistakably human. Tall, wearing what looked like a long coat or jacket. Just standing there, facing the highway, not moving, not waving for help or trying to flag him down, just watching. Thad's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to not stop, to not investigate. But what if it was someone who needed help? What if it was a trooper from the wrecked patrol car, injured and disoriented? He eased off the accelerator even more, bringing the truck down to a crawl. The figure didn't move, didn't react to his approach at all. And as he got closer, Thad realized something that made his blood run cold. The figure wasn't standing on the snow. It was standing in the snow, as if it had been there long enough to sink down several inches. But the snow had only started falling heavily in the last 20 minutes. The CB crackled. "Do not stop!" A different voice this time, clear and urgent. "Eastbound traffic at mile marker 275. Do not stop. Keep moving. Get clear of the pass." Thad grabbed the microphone. "Who is this? What's going on up here?" No answer, just static. He tried it again. "This is eastbound Merriweather hauling mining equipment. I need to know what's happening. There's someone standing in the median and I think they might need help." The static continued for a long moment. Then the voice came back, fainter this time. "Not someone. Keep moving." Thad's hands were shaking again, harder now. He pressed the accelerator and felt the truck lurch forward on the ice, the tires spinning for a second before finding purchase. He was past the figure now, but he couldn't stop himself from looking in the passenger side mirror. The figure was still there, still motionless, but now it had turned. It was facing his direction, watching him drive away. And even though the distance and the snow made details impossible to see, Thad had the overwhelming certainty that the figure had no face. Just a blank expanse where features should have been. He drove faster, pushing the truck up to 50 despite the ice, despite the snow, despite every rule of safe winter driving. He needed to get off this mountain, needed to reach a place with lights and people and normalcy. The CB was silent now, not even static, as if the radio had been unplugged. His phone still showed no signal. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m., exactly 17 minutes later than the last time he'd checked, even though it felt like hours had passed. Mile marker 276. Mile marker 277. The snow was easing slightly, visibility improving from near zero to maybe 100 yards. Thad could see the road ahead more clearly now, could see that he was climbing toward the summit of the pass. Another mile, and he'd start the descent toward Bozeman, down out of the worst weather, down to where the pavement would be clearer and the ice would thin out. Just one more mile. That's when he saw the vehicle. It was in the eastbound lanes ahead of him, sideways across both lanes, a dark SUV with its hazard lights flashing weakly. As Thad's headlights illuminated it, he could see steam or smoke rising from under the hood, and the driver's side door was hanging open. But like the patrol car, there was no one visible. No driver, no passengers, no one standing on the shoulder waiting for help. Just an abandoned vehicle blocking the highway. Thad's mind raced. He was still sliding on ice, still moving too fast to stop safely. The SUV was directly in his path, and if he tried to swerve around it, he'd either jackknife the trailer or go off the road completely. He had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision. His foot moved to the brake, touching it lightly, feeling the anti-lock system pulse under his boot. The truck shuddered, slowing but not stopping, and he turned the wheel carefully to the left, aiming for the narrow gap between the SUV and the median. The trailer swung out behind him, the rear wheels losing traction and starting to come around. Thad could feel the rig beginning to jackknife, could feel control slipping away. He counter-steered instinctively, turning into the skid, and somehow, miraculously, the trailer straightened out. He shot past the SUV with maybe 6 inches to spare on the left side, close enough to see through the open driver's door, close enough to see that the interior was empty, except for a cell phone lying on the center console, its screen still glowing. Then he was past it, the SUV shrinking in his mirrors, and he was still upright, still moving, still on the road. The descent began, the grade tilting downward, and Thad could feel the truck wanting to accelerate. He kept his foot off the brake and used the jake brake and transmission to control his speed, letting gravity and friction do their work. The snow was definitely lighter now, the wind less intense. He was going to make it. He was going to get down off this mountain and into Bozeman, and he was never going to drive Bozeman Pass at night in winter again, as long as he lived. Mile marker 278 appeared on his right, then 279. The ice was breaking up, patches of wet pavement appearing between the frozen sections. Thad's grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly, his breathing coming easier. Whatever he'd experienced up there near the summit, whatever strange things he'd seen, they were behind him now. He'd made it through. But even as relief flooded through him, a part of his mind was cataloging the impossibilities. The wrecked patrol car with no accident scene, the footprints that appeared from nowhere, the figure in the median, the SUV blocking the road. and that voice on the CB reporting an accident at 11:47 p.m. on November 8th, more than 2 hours before it could possibly happen. The CB suddenly came to life again, clear as a bell, as if the strange interference had never existed. Eastbound traffic descending from Bozeman Pass, how's the road treating you? It was a different voice, friendly and casual, the standard trucker small talk. Thad keyed the mic, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. This is eastbound Merriweather. Roads are getting better past mile marker 280. Still some ice up near the summit, though. You might want to chain up if you're heading west. There was a pause. Then the other driver responded. Roger that. Haven't heard any accident reports tonight, so that's good news. Drive safe out there. No accident reports. Thad thought about the patrol car, about the SUV, about everything he'd seen. He almost asked the other driver if he'd passed any wrecks or emergency vehicles, but something stopped him. What would he say? That he'd seen vehicles that might not have been there? That he'd received CB transmissions from the future? That a faceless figure had watched him from the median? He'd sound crazy. Or worse, he'd sound like someone suffering from highway hypnosis or fatigue-induced hallucinations. So instead, he just acknowledged and set the mic back in its clip. Mile marker 282. The lights of Bozeman were visible now, a warm glow on the horizon that promised civilization and safety. Thad's hands had finally stopped shaking, but his mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. He'd driven through something up there on the pass, experienced something that defied explanation. But what? A premonition? A time slip? A warning? Or just the product of stress and bad weather and a tired mind playing tricks? He'd never know for certain, but as he guided his truck down toward the valley floor, toward the delivery depot and a hot meal and a warm bed, Thaddeus Merriweather made himself a promise. Tomorrow, he'd check the news reports, listen to the police scanner, maybe even call the State Patrol dispatch and ask if there had been any accidents on Bozeman Pass on November 8th. And if he found that there had been a wreck at mile marker 274 at 11:47 p.m., if he learned that a State Patrol vehicle had been struck and damaged at exactly that time and place, then he'd know. He'd know that what he'd experienced wasn't a hallucination or a dream. He'd know that somehow, impossibly, he'd been given a glimpse of something that hadn't happened yet. A warning on the ice. The delivery depot in Bozeman was quiet when Thad pulled in just after 11 p.m. The security guard at the gate, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, waved him through without much interest, barely looking up from his phone. Thad backed the trailer into Dock 7 and killed the engine, but he didn't get out right away. He sat there in the darkness of the cab, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching the snow continue to fall in the yellow pools of the parking lot lights. His hands had stopped shaking an hour ago, but the memory of what he'd seen on the pass was still vivid, still refusing to fade into the comfortable blur of road fatigue. He finally climbed down from the cab and walked into the depot office to complete the paperwork. The night manager, a thin woman in her 40s with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, processed his delivery receipt with efficient indifference. "Equipment's not needed until morning anyway," she said, stamping the forms. "You can park in the lot overnight if you want. There's a diner 2 blocks east that's open 24 hours. Thad thanked her and asked if she'd heard anything about accidents on the pass tonight. She shook her head. Been quiet. Storm kept most of the traffic off the roads. You have any trouble coming over? He hesitated, then just said the ice was bad near the summit and left it at that. The diner was called the Grizzly Peak, and it looked exactly like every other truck stop restaurant Thad had ever been in. Vinyl booths, laminate tables, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, and the smell of coffee and fryer grease hanging in the air. There were only 3 other customers at this hour, all of them sitting alone at separate booths, staring at their phones or into their coffee cups. Thad took a seat at the counter and ordered eggs, hash browns, and black coffee from a waitress whose name tag read Tansy. She was maybe 60, with dyed red hair and the practiced smile of someone who'd been working the night shift for decades. "Just come over the pass?" Tansy asked as she poured his coffee. Thad nodded. "Road's pretty bad up there?" He wrapped his hands around the warm mug and considered his answer. "Ice was pretty bad around mile marker 274. Saw some emergency vehicles. Looked like there might have been an accident earlier." Tansy's expression didn't change. "That's a bad stretch in winter. Lost a lot of people up there over the years. Ice forms up so fast sometimes drivers don't even know they're on it until they're sliding." She moved away to put his order in, and Thad pulled out his phone. Still no missed calls from the dispatcher, no messages, nothing unusual. He opened a browser and searched for Bozeman Pass accident November 8th, but the results showed nothing recent. Just old news articles about previous wrecks, weather advisories, and road condition reports. The food arrived and Thad ate mechanically, not really tasting it, his mind still trying to process what he'd experienced. The wrecked patrol car had been real, he was certain of that. He'd seen the damaged door, the shattered windows, the emergency lights still flashing. But if there had been an accident serious enough to crush a state patrol vehicle like that, where were the other emergency responders? Where was the ambulance, the fire truck, the tow trucks? Where was the trooper who'd been driving? And what about those tracks in the snow, those parallel grooves that seemed to pass right through where the patrol car sat? What could have made marks like that? He was chasing these thoughts in circles when Tansy came back to refill his coffee. "You look like you saw a ghost up there on the pass," she said. And though her tone was light, her eyes were serious. Thad met her gaze and saw something there, a flicker of knowing, as if she'd heard this kind of story before. "Just tired," he said. "Long day." She nodded slowly. "My husband used to drive truck. Ran the Billings-Bozeman route for 30 years. He told me once that the pass gets strange sometimes, especially in winter. Said there are nights when things don't quite line up right, when you see things that maybe already happened or maybe haven't happened yet." He stopped driving it at night after a while. Wouldn't say why exactly, just that it wasn't worth it. Before Thad could respond, the door to the diner opened and a state trooper walked in, stomping snow off his boots. He was young, maybe early 30s, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of weathered face that came from spending too much time outdoors in harsh conditions. His name tag read Haraway. Tansy greeted him by first name and poured him coffee without asking. Lucien Haraway took a seat 2 stools down from Thad and wrapped his hands around the mug exactly the way Thad had done. "Hell of a night," he said to no one in particular. "Been running calls since 6, multiple slide-offs, couple of jackknifes, 1 fatality out past Livingston." Thad's pulse quickened. "Anything up on the pass? Around mile marker 274? Haraway turned to look at him, his cop eyes automatically cataloging and assessing. "Not that I heard. Why, you see something up there?" Thad chose his words carefully. "Thought I saw emergency lights. Looked like maybe a patrol car had been in an accident. But when I got closer, there was nobody around." Haraway's expression shifted, became more guarded. "What time was this?" Thad checked his phone. "About 9:30, maybe 9:45. The trooper was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "We didn't have any units in that area tonight. Budget cuts were spread pretty thin. Closest car to the pass would have been me, and I've been down in the valley all evening." Something about the way Haraway said it felt off to Thad, like the trooper was being carefully truthful but not completely forthcoming. The vehicle I saw had Montana State Patrol markings, Thad pressed. White Ford Explorer looked like it had been T-boned on the driver's side. Lights were still flashing, but no one was there. Haraway's jaw tightened. He glanced at Tansy, and Thad saw her give a small shake of her head, a gesture so subtle he almost missed it. "Like I said," Haraway repeated, "we didn't have any units up there tonight. Maybe you saw an old wreck that hadn't been cleared yet, or maybe the weather was playing tricks. Happens sometimes in heavy snow." Thad knew he was being dismissed, knew that the trooper wasn't going to give him anything more. But the look that had passed between Haraway and Tansy told him they both knew something they weren't saying. He decided to push a little harder. "What about the CB radio? I was monitoring Channel 19 and I heard someone giving an accident report for mile marker 274. Said the time was 11:47 p.m., but that was impossible because it was only 9:30 when I heard it." Now, Haraway's expression changed completely. The professional cop mask slipped, and for just a second, Thad saw something else underneath, something that looked like fear. "You heard that transmission?" the trooper asked quietly. Thad nodded, clear as day, kept repeating the same information over and over. Mile marker 274, November 8th, 11:47 p.m., multiple vehicle accident, black ice conditions. The diner had gone very quiet. Even the other customers seemed to be listening now, though they weren't looking directly at the conversation. Tansy had stopped moving, standing frozen with the coffee pot in her hand. Haraway stared at Thad for a long moment, then seemed to come to some kind of decision. "How long you planning to be in town?" he asked. "I've got some things I need to check on, and I might need to talk to you again tomorrow." Thad shrugged. "I'm empty until my dispatcher lines up another load. Could be here a day or two." Haraway pulled out a business card and slid it across the counter. "Call me tomorrow morning. Not on the department line. Use my cell number on the back, and don't talk to anyone else about what you saw tonight." Not yet. Before Thad could ask why, Haraway stood up, dropped a $5 bill on the counter, and walked out of the diner without touching his coffee. Through the window, Thad watched him sit in his patrol car for several minutes, talking on his radio, before finally driving away. Tansy came over and topped off Thad's mug even though it was still mostly full. "Lucian Haraway is a good man," she said quietly. "If he says not to talk about it, there's probably a reason. This town has a long memory, and some things are better left alone." Thad wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her expression told him she'd already said more than she intended. He finished his meal in silence and paid his bill. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear, revealing patches of stars between the clouds. The temperature had dropped even further, and Thad's breath formed white clouds in the air as he walked back toward the depot. The streets of Bozeman were nearly empty. Just a few cars creeping along the icy roads, their headlights creating overlapping cones of light in the darkness. Thad's truck was where he'd left it, parked in the secure lot behind the depot, and he climbed into the sleeper berth with the intention of getting a few hours of rest before morning. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that wrecked patrol car, saw the faceless figure standing in the median, saw those impossible tracks cutting through the snow. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the tick and creak of the cooling engine, watching the shadows move across the ceiling of the sleeper berth as headlights from the street passed by. Around 1 a.m. he gave up and climbed back into the driver's seat, turning on the CB radio more out of habit than any real purpose. The radio crackled to life and he scanned through the channels, listening to the late-night chatter of other drivers scattered across the western states. On Channel 19, he heard the familiar voices of truckers swapping stories and sharing information. Someone was talking about weather in Wyoming. Someone else was complaining about load rates. Normal conversation, comfortable and mundane. Thad was about to switch off the radio when he heard it again. That same voice, that same mechanical tone breaking through the other transmissions. Mile marker 274, November 8th, 11:47 p.m., eastbound collision, multiple vehicles, black ice conditions. The same loop he'd heard on the pass, repeating endlessly. Thad grabbed the microphone. "Who is this? Identify yourself." The transmission continued, ignoring him. Mile marker 274, November 8th, 11:47 p.m. Other voices broke in now, other drivers hearing the strange broadcast. "Someone's got a stuck mic," one said. "Must be transmitting on a loop somehow." Another voice, older and more weathered. "That's not a stuck mic, that's the pass. You new boys probably haven't heard it before, but that transmission's been coming through on and off for years. Always the same message, always about an accident at 274. Thad keyed the mic again. "This is Merriweather. I drove through 274 tonight and I saw a wrecked patrol car up there. Is this transmission related to that?" The older voice came back immediately. "You saw it, the Explorer with the crushed door?" Thad confirmed. "Then you're lucky to be talking to us right now," the voice continued. "Most people who see that car don't make it off the pass." The CB erupted with multiple voices then, everyone trying to talk at once. Someone was calling the older driver crazy, saying it was just a local legend. Someone else was defending the story, claiming their brother had seen the same thing back in the 80s. Thad tried to cut through the noise. "Can someone please explain what's going on? What is that patrol car?" The older voice came back, and this time the static was less pronounced, as if the driver had gotten closer. "It's a ghost, son. A warning. That transmission you heard, that's from a real accident that happened back in 1987. Trooper named Whitlock was responding to a multi-vehicle pileup at mile marker 274 during a winter storm. Black ice conditions, just like the message says. She got hit by a semi that was sliding out of control, T-boned right on the driver's side. Killed her instantly." Thad felt cold despite the heater running. "Whitlock? That was the trooper's name?" the voice confirmed. "Tansy Whitlock. Young woman, only been on the force about 3 years. They say she was trying to warn eastbound traffic about the ice when she got hit. And ever since then, on certain nights, her patrol car appears up there on the pass. Some people see it, some don't. But everyone who does see it hears that transmission. Her last report before the accident. And the thing is, it's always dated for the future. Whatever time you hear it, it's always a couple hours ahead. Like she's trying to warn people about what's going to happen." Thad's mind was racing. Tansy Whitlock. The waitress at the diner was named Tansy. That couldn't be a coincidence. "Was Trooper Whitlock related to anyone in Bozeman?" he asked. The older driver didn't know, but another voice chimed in. "Her mother still lives here, owns the Grizzly Peak Diner. Real nice lady, been running that place for 40 years. Never talks about what happened to her daughter, though." The pieces were falling into place now, and Thad didn't like the picture they were forming. The waitress who'd told him about her truck-driving husband, who'd warned him that some things were better left alone. She'd lost her daughter on that pass, had been living with that loss for over 30 years. He was about to ask more questions when the CB went dead again. Not static, not interference, just complete silence as if someone had pulled the plug on every radio in the state. Thad switched channels, tried different frequencies, but got nothing. His phone showed it was 1:47 a.m., and outside the truck he could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. Multiple vehicles by the sound of it, all heading in the same direction. He climbed out of the cab and walked to the edge of the parking lot where he could see the street. Fire trucks and ambulances were racing past, their lights painting the snow red and white as they headed west toward the interstate, toward Bozeman Pass, toward mile marker 274, and according to his phone, it was exactly 2 hours before 11:47 p.m. would arrive. Thad pulled out the business card Haraway had given him and dialed the cell number on the back. The trooper answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake despite the hour. Haraway. Thad didn't bother with preliminaries. There's an accident happening right now on the pass, isn't there? At mile marker 274. There was a long silence, then Haraway sighed. How did you know? Thad explained about the CB transmission, about what the other drivers had told him, about the pattern. Every time someone sees that patrol car and hears that transmission, does an accident actually happen 2 hours later? Not every time, Haraway said quietly, but often enough that we take it seriously. I got the call about 20 minutes ago. Semi jackknifed on the ice at 274, took out 2 passenger vehicles and another truck. 3 fatalities so far, maybe more. We're still working the scene. Thad's legs felt weak. I drove through that exact spot tonight. If I'd been 2 hours later... He didn't finish the sentence. Haraway finished it for him. You would have been right in the middle of it. Whatever you saw up there tonight, whatever you heard on that radio, it saved your life. Trooper Whitlock is still trying to do her job, still trying to warn people, even 37 years after she died doing it. Thad thought about the faceless figure he'd seen in the median, the way it had turned to watch him drive past. Had that been Tansy Whitlock? Was she still up there on the pass, still standing guard, still trying to prevent the kind of tragedy that had taken her life? What about the SUV I saw blocking the road? He asked. Was that part of the warning too? Haraway was quiet for a moment. I don't know. The reports from 87 mentioned a Ford Bronco that was involved in the pileup, blocking the eastbound lanes. Could be that's what you saw. Could be the whole scene plays out the same way every time, like a recording. Or could be she's showing you what's going to happen, trying to get you to understand the danger. They talked for a few more minutes, Haraway, explaining that he'd need a formal statement in the morning, that there would be questions about what Thad had seen and heard. But it was clear the trooper already believed him, already knew the story because he'd probably heard it before from other drivers. When they hung up, Thad walked back to his truck and climbed into the sleeper berth. This time he didn't try to sleep. He just lay there in the darkness, thinking about a young state trooper named Tansy Whitlock, who'd died trying to warn people about black ice and who apparently hadn't let death stop her from continuing that mission. At exactly 11:47 p.m., or rather 11:47 a.m. on the clock now, since it had rolled past midnight, Thad turned on the CB radio one more time. The transmission came through immediately, clear and strong. Mile marker 274, November 8th, 11:47 p.m., eastbound collision, multiple vehicles, black ice conditions. But this time, after the standard loop, there was something else. A woman's voice, young and clear, speaking directly through the static. Drive safe out there. The roads can turn on you in a heartbeat. Watch for ice. Then silence. Thad grabbed the microphone. Trooper Whitlock, is that you? No response. Just the normal chatter of the CB resuming. Drivers talking about routes and weather and all the mundane details of life on the road. But Thad knew what he'd heard. Knew that somewhere on Bozeman Pass, in the snow and the darkness and the cold, Tansy Whitlock was still on duty, still protecting travelers, still doing her job the only way she could. And he knew that her mother, serving coffee and eggs in a diner 2 blocks away, carried the weight of that knowledge every day, unable to talk about it, unable to explain that her daughter had never really left. As dawn began to break over the mountains, painting the snow pink and gold, Thad made a decision. When his dispatcher called with the next load, he'd turn it down if it meant driving Bozeman Pass. He'd find other routes, other jobs, other ways to make a living. Not because he was afraid, though he was, but because some roads demanded a price for passage that he wasn't willing to pay. And because he now understood that the warnings he'd received weren't just about physical danger. They were about something deeper, something that lingered in the places where tragedy had occurred, something that couldn't rest until its work was done. The sun rose fully, burning off the last of the clouds, and Bozeman came to life around him. But Thad knew he'd never see this town or this highway the same way again. Thad spent the next morning at the State Patrol office giving his statement to Lucian Haraway. The trooper's office was a small room in the back of the building, walls covered with maps and incident reports, a coffee maker gurgling in the corner that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. Haraway took notes by hand, old school, filling out forms in careful block letters while Thad recounted everything he'd seen on the pass the night before. The wrecked Explorer, the tracks in the snow, the figure in the median, the CB transmission. Haraway listened without interruption, his expression neutral, giving nothing away. When Thad finished, Haraway set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "I need to show you something," he said. He opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, the kind that gets added to over years, pages yellow with age mixed with newer printouts. He spread photographs across his desk, and Thad felt his stomach drop. They were accident scene photos from 1987, taken on a winter night that looked identical to the one Thad had just driven through. Snow falling, emergency lights reflecting off ice. And there, in the center of several shots, was the white Ford Explorer with the crushed driver's side door, exactly as Thad had seen it. These were taken at 11:52 p.m. on November 8, 1987, Haraway said quietly. 5 minutes after Trooper Whitlock radioed in her position at mile marker 274. The semi that hit her was eastbound, driver lost control on black ice, couldn't stop. The vehicle spun sideways and T-boned her patrol car while she was parked on the shoulder with her lights on, trying to warn traffic. He pointed to another photo, this one showing parallel grooves in the snow crossing the eastbound lanes. These marks are from the semi's trailer. It was a flatbed hauling steel I-beams. When it jackknifed, the beams shifted and dragged across the pavement. That's what made those tracks you saw. Thad stared at the photographs, his mouth dry. Every detail matched. The position of the vehicle, the pattern of damage, even the way the emergency lights cast their glow across the snow. "How is this possible?" he asked. "How can something that happened 37 years ago just appear on that highway like it's happening again?" Haraway gathered the photos back into the folder. "I've asked myself that question for the 5 years I've been working this area. I've talked to other troopers, older guys who were here when it happened. I've talked to truck drivers, locals, even brought in someone from the university to study the phenomenon. Nobody has an answer that makes sense." He pulled out another document, this one a log of reported sightings. Thad scanned the entries and felt a chill run through him. The sightings went back decades, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Different dates, different drivers, but always the same details. Always around mile marker 274, always in winter conditions, always with the CB transmission warning of an accident hours before it occurred. "Not everyone who sees it reports it," Haraway explained. "Most drivers probably think they're hallucinating, or they're too spooked to say anything. But enough people have come forward over the years that we can't dismiss it. And here's the thing that really bothers me." He tapped the log. In 80% of the cases where someone reported seeing Trooper Whitlock's vehicle, there was an actual accident at that location within the next few hours. Thad thought about the pileup that had happened at 11:47 the previous night, about the 3 people who'd died because they'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the warning is real, he said. She's actually preventing accidents by showing up, by giving people advance notice. Haraway nodded slowly. That's what we think. But here's what I can't figure out. Why do some people see her and others don't? Last night, there were at least a dozen vehicles that passed through that area between 9 o'clock and 11 p.m. You're the only one who reported seeing anything unusual. The cars that ended up in the pileup, they drove right through without stopping, without even slowing down. So why you? Why did she show herself to you? It was a question Thad had been asking himself since dawn. He had no answer. He wasn't special, wasn't particularly religious or spiritual, had never experienced anything paranormal before in his life. He was just a truck driver doing his job, same as thousands of others on the roads every night. Maybe it's random, he offered. Maybe she appears to everyone, but only some people actually see her. Haraway didn't look convinced. Or maybe there's a pattern we haven't figured out yet. A reason why certain people are chosen to receive the warning. He closed the folder and locked it back in the filing cabinet. I need you to do something for me. If you ever drive that route again, if you ever see anything unusual on Bozeman Pass, I want you to call me immediately. Day or night, doesn't matter. And I want you to keep a record of exactly what you see, what time you see it. Weather conditions, everything. Thad wanted to tell him that he'd never be driving Bozeman Pass again, that he'd decided to find other routes, but something stopped him. Some instinct told him that this wasn't over, that whatever had happened last night had connected him to that stretch of highway in a way he couldn't just walk away from. So instead he nodded and promised to call if anything came up. Haraway walked him out to the parking lot where Thad's rig sat waiting, the chrome catching the weak November sunlight. One more thing, the trooper said as they stood beside the truck. Tansy Whitlock, the woman who runs the diner, she knows what you saw last night. She's known about her daughter's presence on that highway for 37 years. If you want to understand what's happening, you should talk to her. The Grizzly Peak was busier during the lunch hour, the booths filled with construction workers and local business people taking their midday break. Thad found Tansy behind the counter, pouring coffee and chatting with customers as if she didn't have a care in the world. But when she saw him come in, something shifted in her expression. She gave him a small nod, barely perceptible, and gestured toward the back booth. Thad made his way through the crowded diner and slid into the seat. A few minutes later, Tansy appeared with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. Figured you'd be back, she said, sitting down across from him. Up close, in the daylight, Thad could see the resemblance. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw. She looked like an older version of the woman in the photograph Haraway had shown him from the personnel file. Trooper Tansy Whitlock, age 26, smiling in her dress uniform. Lucian told me you gave a statement this morning, she continued. Told me you saw my daughter's car on the pass, heard her voice on the radio. Thad nodded, unsure what to say. How did you talk to a mother about her dead daughter appearing on a highway as a ghost? Tansy saved him from having to figure it out. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm some grief-stricken old woman who's convinced herself her daughter is still alive in some way because I can't let go. But that's not what this is. I know Tansy is dead. I buried her in 1987, went to the funeral, watched them lower her casket into the ground. She's gone, and no amount of wishing will bring her back. She paused, staring down into her coffee cup. But something of her stayed behind on that pass. Something that won't rest, won't move on, and I think I know why. She told Thad about the night of the accident, details that hadn't been in the official reports or the newspaper articles. How her daughter had volunteered for the night shift even though she had the next day off, because another trooper had called in sick and they were short-staffed. How she'd been excited about a date she had planned for the following weekend with a guy she'd met at a training seminar. How she'd called her mother from the patrol car around 9 p.m. to check in, to say the roads were getting bad and she was heading up to the pass to monitor conditions. That was the last time Tansy heard her daughter's voice. The real voice, not the one that came through on CB radios in the middle of winter nights. The thing about my Tansy, the older woman said, was that she took her job seriously. Too seriously, her sergeant used to say. She believed that being a state trooper meant protecting people, really protecting them, not just writing tickets and directing traffic. So when she got the call about vehicles sliding off the road at mile marker 274, she didn't hesitate. She went straight there and set up to warn eastbound traffic. She was doing everything right, everything by the book. But the semi that hit her, the driver never saw her lights. He was going too fast for conditions, wasn't paying attention, and by the time he realized he was on ice, it was too late. Tansy's hands tightened around her coffee cup. He survived, you know. The truck driver. Walked away with minor injuries while my daughter died instantly. They charged him with negligent homicide, but he only served 18 months. 18 months for taking my baby's life. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a flat recitation of facts, as if she'd told this story so many times the emotion had been worn smooth. But here's the thing I've come to understand over all these years. My daughter died trying to save lives, and she's still trying to save lives. Every time she appears on that highway, every time someone sees her car or hears her voice, she's doing exactly what she was doing the night she was killed. She's warning people, protecting them, and I have to believe that she's succeeded more times than she's failed. Thad thought about the 3 people who died in the pileup at 11:47 p.m., wondered if Trooper Whitlock considered those deaths a failure. "How many people do you think she's saved?" he asked. Tansy shrugged. No way to know for sure. How do you count the accidents that didn't happen? The drivers who saw her warning and slowed down, or took a different route, or pulled over to wait out the storm? All I know is what Lucian tells me, and what other troopers have told me over the years. That on nights when someone reports seeing my daughter's patrol car, the accident rate on that section of highway drops significantly. People are more careful, more aware. Maybe that's her real gift, not preventing every tragedy, but making people pay attention to the danger. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the diner washing over them. Finally, Thad asked the question that had been nagging at him since the previous night. Why did I see her? What made me different from all the other drivers on the road last night? Tansy looked at him with those knowing eyes that had seen too much loss and somehow survived it. I think she chooses people who will listen, people who will take the warning seriously instead of dismissing it. You didn't just see her car and keep driving. You noticed the details, asked questions, tried to understand. And when you heard her voice on the radio, you paid attention. That's why she showed herself to you. Before Thad could respond, his phone rang. The dispatcher finally calling with a new load assignment. Thad stepped outside to take the call, expecting to hear about a run to Seattle, or maybe down to Salt Lake City. Instead, the dispatcher told him about a rush delivery that needed to be picked up in Butte and delivered to Billings by the following morning. The route would take him back over Bozeman Pass, westbound this time, leaving tonight. The pay was good, double the usual rate because of the tight timeline and the winter conditions. Thad started to decline, started to say he wasn't available, but something made him pause. He looked back through the diner window at Tansy, sitting alone in the booth, staring at nothing. He thought about Trooper Whitlock standing in the median in the snow, turning to watch him drive past, still doing her duty 3 decades after her death. And he thought about what Haraway had said, about there maybe being a reason why certain people received the warning. "I'll take it," he told the dispatcher. "Send me the pickup details." When he went back inside, Tansy was gone. The booth was empty, the coffee cups cleared away. But there was a note left on the table, written in precise handwriting on the back of a diner receipt. "Be careful on the pass tonight. She'll be watching for you." Thad picked up the load in Butte just after 5 p.m. It was industrial machinery, heavy enough that he'd need to take the mountain grade slowly and carefully. The sun was already setting as he headed east on I-90, the sky turning deep purple and orange behind the peaks. Weather reports called for clear conditions overnight, temperatures dropping into the teens, roads dry. No snow in the forecast. No ice warnings. Just a cold, clear November night in the Montana mountains. Thad should have felt relieved, but instead he felt a growing sense of unease as he approached the pass. Mile marker 274 westbound was the mirror image of the eastbound side where Trooper Whitlock had died, separated by a median but sharing the same elevation and exposure to wind. If black ice formed on one side, it would form on the other. Thad checked his mirrors and saw only a few scattered vehicles behind him, their headlights small and distant. Traffic was light tonight. Most sensible people already home for the evening, not willing to risk mountain driving in the cold. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and settled in for the climb, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in his stomach. The pass looked different at night, more imposing somehow, the mountains rising dark against the stars on either side. Thad's headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, illuminating the white fog line and the reflective mile markers as they counted down. 280, 279, 278. The pavement was dry, his tires gripping normally, no sign of ice. The CB radio was quiet, except for occasional distant chatter from other drivers scattered across the state. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And yet Thad couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting ahead in the darkness. At mile marker 276, he saw the first sign that his instincts were correct. Flares, the old-fashioned kind that burned with a red flame, were set out in a pattern across the westbound lanes, warning of something ahead. Thad slowed down, scanning the road for whatever hazard the flares were marking. But he couldn't see anything. No accident, no construction, no disabled vehicle. Just the empty highway and those burning flares casting their red glow across the pavement. He reached for the CB microphone. "Westbound on I-90 approaching mile marker 276. Anybody know what's with the flares? I'm not seeing any kind of incident here." No response. The CB remained silent. Thad crept forward, passing between the flares, expecting to see emergency vehicles or road workers at any moment. But there was nothing. Just more empty highway stretching ahead into the darkness. He checked his mirrors and saw the flares receding behind him, still burning, still marking nothing. His unease deepened. Someone had set out those flares, and recently too, because they were still burning strong. But who and why? He grabbed the mic again. "This is westbound Merriweather at mile marker 276. If there's DOT or State Patrol working this area, please advise. I've got flares set out, but no visible work zone." This time he got a response, but it wasn't what he expected. Static-filled and distorted, a woman's voice breaking through in fragments. "Westbound, 274, watch for crossing." It was the same voice he'd heard the previous night, Trooper Whitlock's voice, giving a warning he couldn't quite make out. Thad's pulse quickened. "Say again, I didn't copy. What am I watching for?" The static intensified, then cleared suddenly. The voice came through perfectly clear. No distortion, no interference. Watch for the crossing at 274. They don't always stop. Then silence. They don't always stop. What did that mean? Who doesn't stop? Thad's mind raced as he approached mile marker 274, his speed down to 35 miles per hour now, his eyes scanning the road ahead for whatever danger Trooper Whitlock was warning him about. The westbound lanes were empty, no traffic visible in either direction. The pavement was still dry. The temperature gauge on his dash read 18 degrees, cold enough for ice, but no moisture to freeze. Everything looked safe. Everything looked normal. And then he saw them. Headlights appearing suddenly in his lane, heading directly toward him. 2 vehicles, maybe 3, driving westbound in the eastbound lanes. No, that wasn't right. They were in his lanes, the westbound lanes, but they were going the wrong direction. They were heading east directly into oncoming traffic, directly toward Thad's truck. He jerked the steering wheel right, pulling onto the shoulder as the headlights bore down on him. For a fraction of a second, he could see the vehicles clearly. Old cars, 1980s models, a sedan, and a station wagon, and something that looked like a Bronco. They passed him in a rush of displaced air and were gone, vanishing into the darkness behind him. Thad stood on the brakes, the anti-lock system pulsing under his foot as the truck shuddered to a stop on the narrow shoulder. His heart was slamming against his ribs, his breath coming in short gasps. He grabbed the CB mic with shaking hands. "Westbound Merriweather at mile marker 274. I just had 3 vehicles pass me going the wrong way. They were heading east in the westbound lanes. Someone needs to stop them before they cause a head-on collision." He waited for a response, any response, but the radio stayed silent. He tried again, his voice rising. "This is an emergency. Wrong-way drivers at mile marker 274. Finally, a voice came back. It was Lucian Haraway, and he sounded exhausted. "Merriweather, this is Trooper Haraway. I need you to calm down and tell me exactly what you saw." Thad described the vehicles, their direction of travel, their approximate speed. Haraway listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "Those vehicles were part of the original accident in 1987. They're what Trooper Whitlock was trying to warn eastbound traffic about when she was killed. 3 cars had lost control on black ice and ended up going the wrong way. She saw them coming and tried to alert approaching vehicles. That's what you just saw. Not real cars, echoes." Echoes. Thad looked in his mirrors but saw only darkness. The vehicles were gone, if they'd ever really been there at all. "I felt them pass me," he said. "I felt the wind from them." Haraway sighed. "I know. Other drivers have reported the same thing. It feels completely real, but if you check your dashcam footage, if you've got one running, you won't see anything. Just an empty highway and your truck swerving onto the shoulder for no apparent reason." Thad realized the trooper was right. His dashcam had been recording the whole time. He could review the footage and prove to himself what had really happened. But somehow he knew what he'd find. Nothing, just like Haraway said. "Why is this happening?" Thad asked. "Why am I seeing things from 1987? Haraway's answer was barely audible over the radio static. "Because some nights on that pass, time doesn't work the way it should. The accident keeps replaying itself over and over, like a loop. Trooper Whitlock trying to save lives, the wrong-way vehicles, the whole tragedy. And sometimes people like you get caught in it, get shown what happened as a warning about what could happen. I don't understand it, nobody does, but I've learned to accept it." He paused. "Are you okay to keep driving? Because if you need to pull over and wait for daylight, I can arrange for another trooper to sit with you." Thad looked ahead at the dark highway stretching toward Billings. Behind him, mile marker 274 was already receding into the distance. Whatever he'd experienced, whatever he'd seen, it was over now. The road ahead looked normal. Felt normal. "I'm okay," he told Haraway. "I'll keep going." They ended the transmission and Thad pulled back onto the highway, accelerating slowly until he was up to cruising speed. The rest of the drive passed without incident, and he delivered his load to Billings just before dawn. But as he headed back empty toward Bozeman, as the sun rose over the mountains and burned away the night, Thaddeus Merriweather knew he would be returning to this highway again, would be driving this pass again. Because somehow, impossibly, he'd become part of the story that wouldn't end, connected to a trooper who died before he ever started driving truck, bound to a stretch of road where the past and present collided in ways that defied explanation. 3 weeks passed before Thad drove Bozeman Pass again. 3 weeks of hauling loads through Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, always finding reasons to take routes that avoided Interstate 90 through Montana. His dispatcher noticed and started asking questions, wondering why Thad was turning down profitable runs that would take him through his home state. Thad made excuses about wanting to see different country, about avoiding the winter weather in the mountains, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. He was afraid, not of the road itself, not of the ice or the snow or the steep grades. He was afraid of what he might see there, afraid of being pulled deeper into something he didn't understand. But avoidance only worked for so long in the trucking business. Eventually, the loads dried up on the routes he'd been running, and eventually his dispatcher called with an offer he couldn't refuse. A high-priority shipment of medical equipment from Spokane to Billings, premium pay, tight deadline. The most direct route was I-90 through Missoula and over Bozeman Pass. Thad tried to negotiate an alternate route, maybe south through Idaho and up through Wyoming, but the dispatcher was firm. The customer needed the equipment by morning, and the only way to make that happen was the direct shot across Montana. Thad sat in his truck outside a warehouse in Spokane, staring at his phone, knowing what his answer had to be, but not wanting to say it. Finally, he took the load. The drive across the Idaho Panhandle was uneventful, the highways clear and dry despite the December cold. Thad crossed into Montana just after sunset, the western sky still holding on to the last traces of daylight, deep purple fading to black. He stopped for fuel in Missoula and checked the weather reports. Clear skies overnight, temperatures in the low 20s, no precipitation forecast. The road conditions website showed green across the board for I-90, all chains removed, bare pavement reported. It should have been an easy run, a routine night's work, but Thad's hands were sweating as he climbed back into his cab and pointed the truck east toward Bozeman. Mile markers counted down as he climbed into the mountains. 120, 110, 100. The highway curved and twisted through the darkness, following the path of the Clark Fork River, hemmed in by peaks that rose invisible against the night sky. Thad had the CB radio on, monitoring the usual chatter, listening for any hint of trouble ahead. A driver heading westbound reported good conditions over the pass, dry roads, and light traffic. Another voice confirmed, saying he'd just come through without any issues. Everything pointed to a normal crossing, nothing to worry about. And yet, Thad couldn't shake the feeling that had been building since Spokane, the certainty that something was waiting for him up on that pass. At mile marker 90, his CB radio crackled, and Lucian Haraway's voice came through. "Eastbound traffic approaching Bozeman Pass. This is Montana State Patrol. Be advised, we're conducting a safety check at mile marker 274. All commercial vehicles, please prepare to stop." Thad grabbed the microphone. "Trooper Haraway, this is Merriweather. What kind of safety check?" There was a pause, longer than it should have been, and when Haraway responded, his voice was tight. "Just routine, Merriweather. Need to talk to you for a few minutes when you come through. Nothing to worry about." But something in the trooper's tone told Thad there was plenty to worry about. He found Haraway's patrol car parked on the shoulder at mile marker 274, right where Trooper Whitlock's vehicle had appeared 3 weeks ago. The trooper was standing beside his car, breath forming white clouds in the headlight beams, and he waved Thad over to the shoulder. Thad pulled off the highway and climbed down from his cab, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. "What's going on?" he asked. Haraway looked tired, older than he had 3 weeks ago, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. "I need you to see something," he said. "Come with me." He led Thad across the shoulder to the edge of the median and pointed down at the snow. Footprints. The same footprints Thad had seen 3 weeks ago, running parallel to the highway before angling off toward the center of the median. But these were fresh, made within the last hour, according to Haraway, and they led to a spot about 50 yards away where something dark was lying in the snow. "I got a call about an hour ago," Haraway said quietly. Westbound driver reported seeing a woman standing in the median at this exact location. Said she was wearing what looked like a state patrol uniform. He slowed down to check on her, but by the time he got stopped and backed up, she was gone. Just those footprints leading to that spot where you can see something lying in the snow. Thad felt his stomach clench. "What is it? What's lying there?" Haraway didn't answer, just started walking toward the dark shape in the median. Thad followed, his boots crunching through the frozen crust, his breath coming faster than the walking warranted. As they got closer, he could see it was a coat, a heavy winter coat spread out on the snow as if someone had been lying there and simply vanished, leaving only the coat behind. Haraway knelt down beside it and turned on his flashlight. The coat was a Montana State Patrol issue jacket, the kind troopers wore in winter. The name tag on the breast read Whitlock. Thad took a step back, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. "That's impossible," he said. "That coat should be in evidence storage or donated to charity or destroyed. It shouldn't be here." Haraway stood up, brushing snow off his knees. "I called the evidence room after I found it. Trooper Whitlock's uniform items from the accident were logged and stored for 6 months in 1987, then released to her mother per standard procedure. I called Tansy and asked if she still had her daughter's patrol jacket. She said she'd packed it away in a box in her attic 30 years ago and hadn't looked at it since. I asked her to check. She just called me back. The coat is gone from the box. Just gone." They stood there in the cold and the dark, staring at the jacket lying in the snow. Finally, Thad asked the question neither of them wanted to voice. "Is she trying to tell us something? Is this a message?" Haraway shook his head slowly. "I don't know what this is, but it's the first physical evidence we've ever had that something real is happening here. Not just sightings and voices on the radio, but an actual object that shouldn't exist, appearing in the exact spot where multiple witnesses have reported seeing her." He picked up the jacket carefully, as if it might vanish if handled too roughly. "I'm going to bag this as evidence, and I'm going to request that someone from the State Investigation Unit come take a look. This has gone beyond local folklore. This is something we can't explain away anymore." Thad walked back to his truck, his mind spinning. The coat was real, physical, something that could be touched and photographed and analyzed, which meant the apparitions of Trooper Whitlock weren't just hallucinations or atmospheric phenomena or mass hysteria. She was actually there, somehow, existing in a state that allowed her to manifest physical objects. The implications made Thad dizzy. If she could leave behind a coat, what else could she do? Could she actually interact with the physical world? Could she prevent accidents directly instead of just warning about them? And if so, why didn't she? What were the rules that bound her to that stretch of highway? He was about to climb back into his cab when Haraway called out to him. "Merriweather, wait." The trooper walked over, carrying the bagged jacket. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Have you experienced anything unusual in the last 3 weeks? Dreams, visions, anything that might be related to this?" Thad thought about the nightmares he'd been having. The ones where he was driving through endless snow while faceless figures watched from the roadside. The ones where he heard his CB radio broadcasting warnings about accidents that hadn't happened yet. He'd dismissed them as stress, as his mind processing the strange experiences he'd had. But now he wondered. "Just dreams," he admitted. "Nothing concrete. Why?" Haraway looked uncomfortable. "Because the other drivers who've had encounters with Trooper Whitlock, the ones who've reported seeing her vehicle or hearing her voice, some of them have reported ongoing experiences afterward. Continued sightings, premonitions about accidents, a sense of being watched when they drive this route. It's like she forms a connection with certain people, and that connection doesn't break just because they leave the pass." Thad felt cold that had nothing to do with the December temperature. "Are you saying she's haunting me?" Haraway shrugged. "I'm saying she might be trying to communicate with you, trying to use you for something. I don't know what or why. But if you start experiencing anything more than dreams, anything that affects your ability to drive safely, I need to know about it." Thad promised to call if anything unusual happened, then climbed into his truck and got back on the highway. The rest of the trip to Bozeman passed without incident, and he delivered his load just after midnight. But he couldn't stop thinking about that jacket lying in the snow, about Trooper Whitlock manifesting physical objects, about the possibility that she was reaching out to him specifically for some purpose he didn't yet understand. He checked into a motel and tried to sleep, but the dreams came again. This time, they were more vivid, more specific. He dreamed he was driving the pass during a blizzard, visibility near zero, when he saw a figure standing in the middle of the highway waving frantically for him to stop. He hit the brakes, but the truck kept sliding on ice, sliding toward the figure, and just before impact he jolted awake, his heart hammering. The next morning, Thad drove back to the Grizzly Peak for breakfast. Tansy was there, moving between tables with her coffee pot, and when she saw him she gave a small nod of recognition. He waited until the morning rush had cleared out, then approached her at the counter. "Trooper Haraway told me about your daughter's jacket," he said quietly, "about it appearing in the median." Tansy's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on the coffee pot handle. "I knew that coat was gone the moment he asked me to check. I felt it leave somehow, felt something shift in my house like the air pressure changed. I went up to the attic and the box was still there, still taped shut, but the jacket was gone, like it had never existed." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down beside him at the counter. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I've never told Lucian or any of the other troopers because I knew they'd think I was crazy. But you've seen her now, experienced what she can do, so maybe you'll understand." She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "My daughter appears to certain people for a reason, not randomly. She chooses drivers who are going to be involved in accidents on that pass in the future. Drivers who are going to die there if they don't change something about how they drive, about the choices they make." Thad felt his blood turn cold. "What are you saying?" Tansy met his eyes. "I'm saying that everyone who's reported seeing her vehicle or hearing her voice, everyone who's had a clear, undeniable encounter with her, has either been in a serious accident on that pass within the next year or has avoided one by heeding her warnings. She's not just protecting random travelers. She's protecting specific people who are marked for tragedy. And the fact that she's showing herself to you, the fact that her jacket appeared while you were there, means you're one of them. Means that at some point in your future, maybe soon, maybe months from now, you're going to face a choice on Bozeman Pass. And if you make the wrong choice, you won't survive it. Thad wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was reading too much into coincidence and pattern-seeking. But he thought about the dreams, about the feeling of being watched, about that moment when he'd swerved to avoid the phantom vehicles and felt his truck start to jackknife. He thought about how close he'd come to losing control, how a few more degrees of drift, and he would have rolled the entire rig down the mountainside. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "How do I know what choice she's warning me about?" Tansy shook her head. "You won't know until the moment comes. All you can do is stay alert when you drive that pass. Trust your instincts, and if you see her again, if she appears or speaks to you, listen. Really listen, because she's trying to save your life." Over the next 2 months, Thad drove Bozeman Pass another 8 times, and each time he felt the weight of Tansy's words pressing down on him. He drove more carefully than he ever had, constantly scanning for ice, monitoring weather conditions obsessively, keeping his speed conservative even when the roads were clear. And each time he approached mile marker 274, he felt his pulse quicken, felt that sense of anticipation and dread. But nothing unusual happened. No apparitions, no CB warnings, no phantom vehicles. Just a normal mountain highway with normal winter traffic. He started to wonder if maybe Tansy had been wrong, if maybe the encounters had been a one-time thing, a strange anomaly that wouldn't repeat. Then came the night in late February when everything changed. Thad was eastbound with a load of lumber, running late because of delays at the pickup. It was just after 10 p.m., and he was pushing harder than he should have been, trying to make up time. The weather was clear, the roads dry, and he'd let his speed creep up to 70 on the straightaways. He was approaching mile marker 280 when he saw the flares again. The same red burning flares he'd seen in November. They were set out across both lanes, forcing traffic to slow down. Thad's foot moved toward the brake, but something made him hesitate. The flares hadn't been there 2 minutes ago when the last westbound truck had passed him. There hadn't been time for anyone to set them out. He slowed to 40 miles per hour and crept forward, scanning the road ahead. No accident, no construction, no emergency vehicles, just those burning flares casting their red light across the pavement. And then he saw her. Trooper Tansy Whitlock, standing in the middle of the highway, wearing her patrol uniform and that heavy winter jacket. Her face was clearly visible in his headlights, young and serious, exactly as she'd looked in the photographs. She was holding up her hand in the universal signal for stop, and as Thad's truck rolled closer, she pointed urgently to the right shoulder. Her message was clear. Get off the highway now. Thad didn't question it, didn't hesitate. He pulled onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a complete stop, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Through the windshield he could see Trooper Whitlock still standing in the highway, but she wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking eastbound, toward the summit, and her expression had changed to something that looked like profound sadness. Thad followed her gaze and saw headlights approaching fast from behind. Too fast, a vehicle coming down the grade out of control. It was a pickup truck, swerving wildly from lane to lane, the driver fighting to regain control on a patch of black ice that had formed in the last few minutes. The pickup shot past Thad's stopped truck, doing at least 90 miles per hour, its brake lights flashing uselessly as the driver stood on the pedal. Thad watched in horror as it reached the spot where Trooper Whitlock was standing. He expected her to vanish, to dematerialize like a ghost should, but instead she stood her ground, and for just a fraction of a second, He could have sworn the pickup actually swerved around her, as if the driver could see her and was trying to avoid hitting her. Then the truck was past that spot and sliding toward the median. And Trooper Whitlock turned to look directly at Thad one last time. She nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and then she was gone. Just gone, as if she'd never been there. The pickup truck hit the median at full speed and launched into the air, clearing the barrier and crashing down into the westbound lanes where it rolled multiple times before coming to rest upside down. Thad grabbed his phone and dialed 911, reporting the accident, then grabbed his fire extinguisher and flashlight and ran toward the wreck. The driver was still alive, trapped in the crushed cab, bleeding but conscious. Thad helped stabilize the vehicle and kept the driver talking until emergency services arrived 20 minutes later. The paramedics told him later that the quick response had probably saved the driver's life, that another 10 minutes of bleeding and exposure might have been fatal. Lucian Haraway arrived on scene while they were still extracting the driver from the wreckage. He found Thad sitting on the guardrail, covered in the driver's blood, shaking from adrenaline and cold. "You saw her," Haraway said. It wasn't a question. Thad nodded. "She stopped me, warned me to get off the highway. If I'd been in my lane when that pickup came through, if I'd been doing 70 like I was 5 minutes before, I would have been right where he went out of control. He would have hit me instead of the median." Haraway sat down beside him. "Then she saved 2 lives tonight. Yours and his. That's what she does. That's all she's ever tried to do." They sat in silence while the emergency crews worked, watching the lights flash red and blue across the snow. Finally, Thad asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why me? Why did she choose to save me specifically? I'm just another truck driver, nobody special." Haraway was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe that's exactly why. Maybe she sees something in ordinary people that makes them worth saving. Or maybe you remind her of someone she knew. Or maybe there's no logic to it at all, and she just does what she can, saves who she can, one driver at a time." He stood up and offered Thad his hand. "Whatever the reason, you're alive because of her. Don't waste it." The next morning, Thad went to the Grizzly Peak before leaving town. Tansy was there, and when she saw him, she knew immediately what had happened. She poured him coffee and sat down across from him without saying a word. Finally, Thad broke the silence. "She was real. I saw her face. She was standing right there in the highway, and she warned me, and she saved my life." Tansy's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "I know. Lucian called me last night, told me what happened." She reached across the table and squeezed Thad's hand. "My daughter is still out there protecting people, still doing the job she loved, and that gives me more comfort than you could possibly understand." Thad finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. "Does it ever end? Will she ever be able to rest?" Tansy's smile faded. "I don't know. Maybe when the last person she's meant to save is saved. Maybe when the debt is paid, whatever that debt is. Or maybe she'll be there forever, a guardian on that pass, watching over travelers for as long as people drive those roads." She paused. "But I hope not. I hope someday she finds peace. I hope someday I look up to that pass and I know she's finally gone home." Thad drove Bozeman Pass dozens more times over the following years, and he never saw Trooper Whitlock again. No apparitions, no warnings, no flares. Just a highway through the mountains, beautiful and treacherous and indifferent. But he never forgot what he'd experienced. Never forgot the night she'd stood in the highway and saved his life. And every time he passed mile marker 274, eastbound or westbound, he slowed down, paid attention, watched for ice. Because he knew that somewhere out there, in the spaces between what was and what could be, Tansy Whitlock was still on duty, still protecting travelers, still trying to prevent the kind of tragedy that had taken her life. And Thaddeus Merriweather drove those roads with the awareness that some debts could never be fully repaid, some warnings should always be heeded, and some guardians never stopped watching over the people they'd sworn to protect. The black ice could kill you in an instant, invisible and deadly. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got a warning. You got a chance to change your fate, and if you were smart, you took it. Years later, when other drivers asked Thad about the strangest thing he'd ever experienced on the road, he would tell them about Bozeman Pass, about the wrecked patrol car and the CB transmission from the future, about the trooper who died trying to save lives and never stopped trying. Some believed him, most didn't. But every driver who heard the story remembered it, and when they drove through Montana in winter, when they climbed up into those mountains, and the temperature dropped and the first snowflakes started to fall, they drove a little more carefully, watched a little more closely for ice. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was Trooper Whitlock's real legacy. Not the individual lives saved, but the collective awareness raised. The reminder that the road demands respect, that winter demands caution, and that sometimes the warnings we receive come from the most unexpected sources. Thad never learned why he'd been chosen to receive those warnings, why Trooper Whitlock had appeared to him multiple times when most drivers never saw her at all. But he stopped trying to understand it. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some questions didn't have answers. All he knew was that he'd been given a gift, a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He drove more carefully, helped other drivers when he could, paid attention to warnings, whether they came from weather reports or CB radios or instincts he couldn't explain. And late at night, when he was driving through darkness on some lonely highway far from Montana, he sometimes wondered if Trooper Whitlock had found others like him. Other drivers who needed warnings, who were marked for tragedy, who could be saved if someone just showed them the danger in time. He hoped she had. He hoped she was still out there doing her job, still protecting travelers, still making a difference one warning at a time. Because the alternative, that she was trapped alone on that pass, unable to rest, unable to move on, was too sad to contemplate. The black ice never announced itself. It formed in silence, invisible and deadly, waiting for the unwary. But sometimes, if you were very lucky and very blessed, you got a warning before you hit it. A voice on the radio, a figure in the median, a set of flares that shouldn't exist. And if you were smart, you listened, you slowed down, you survived. That was the lesson Thaddeus Merriweather carried with him for the rest of his driving career, through thousands of miles and hundreds of winter nights. The road was always dangerous, but it didn't have to be fatal. Not if you paid attention to the warnings. Not if you remembered that some guardians never stop watching. Wardell Pritchard had been driving the Upper Peninsula routes for 9 years, and he thought he knew Lake Superior's moods. He'd seen the big lake calm as glass in summer, reflecting the sky like a mirror. He'd seen it gray and angry in October, waves tall enough to swallow a ship whole. But he'd never seen it do what it was doing now, on this December afternoon, as he guided his Peterbilt westbound along M28 between Munising and Marquette. The lake was breathing. That was the only word for it. Huge clouds of mist were rolling off the water, billowing up and across the coastal highway like living things, obscuring the road for minutes at a time before retreating back to the shoreline. The phenomenon had a name, Wardell knew. Lake effect. When the water was still warm from summer and the air temperature plummeted, the difference created these massive steam banks that could reduce visibility to zero in seconds. The locals called it lake smoke, or sea smoke, or sometimes just the breath, because of how it seemed to pulse and flow like something inhaling and exhaling. Wardell had driven through it before, but never this thick, never this persistent. The mist would roll across both lanes of M28, turn the world white for 30 or 40 seconds, then dissipate just enough to let him see 100 yards ahead before the next wave came. It was like driving through curtains, pushing through one only to find another waiting just beyond. He'd left Sault Ste. Marie that morning with a load of paper products destined for a distribution center in Ashland, Wisconsin, a straightforward run he'd made dozens of times. The route took him west along the southern shore of Lake Superior, through the small towns and vast forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, then across the border into Wisconsin. In good weather, it was a beautiful drive, the kind that reminded Wardell why he'd gotten into trucking in the first place. Miles of shoreline, rocky beaches, dense stands of pine and birch, the occasional glimpse of a freighter out on the big lake. But today the beauty was hidden behind walls of mist, and what should have been a 6-hour run was turning into something longer and considerably more tense. The dashboard clock read 3:47 p.m., which meant full darkness would arrive in less than an hour. December this far north meant short days, the sun setting before 5 o'clock, and Wardell wanted to be past the worst of the coastal sections before night fell completely. The mist was bad enough in daylight. At night, with only his headlights cutting through it, it would be nearly impossible to navigate safely. He'd been keeping his speed down to 45, sometimes dropping to 35 when the thickest banks rolled across the highway, and even at that cautious pace he felt like he was pushing his luck. The CB radio was quiet except for occasional static. No other drivers reporting their positions or road conditions. Wardell was alone out here, or felt like it anyway, separated from the rest of the world by these walls of white. He was about 15 miles east of Marquette when he noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. A green highway sign emerged from the mist ahead, the kind that indicated services at the next exit. It showed symbols for gas, food, and lodging, with an arrow pointing to a right-hand exit half a mile ahead. Wardell didn't remember an exit here, not on this particular stretch of road, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. New services opened all the time, and it had been maybe 6 months since his last run through the UP. Maybe someone had built a new truck stop or rest area. The mist was thick enough that he almost missed the actual exit, a narrow ramp peeling off to the right into what looked like dense forest. He wasn't planning to stop, didn't need fuel or food yet, but something made him slow down and look more carefully as he passed. The exit ramp was there, clearly visible for just a moment before the mist swallowed it again. But something about it looked odd. The pavement seemed darker than the main highway, older, maybe, and there were no tire marks visible in the light dusting of snow that had fallen earlier. No one had used this exit recently, which was strange for a service area that supposedly offered gas and food. Wardell filed the observation away and kept driving, but the unease that had been building since he'd first encountered the heavy mist deepened. He grabbed his CB microphone and keyed it. Westbound on M28 about 15 east of Marquette. Anybody out there monitoring? Static. He tried again. Any drivers familiar with this area? Is there a service exit about 15 miles east of Marquette? Just past a sign for gas and food, but I don't remember it being there. No response. The CB remained silent except for that low background hiss that seemed to match the rhythm of the mist rolling across the highway. Wardell hung up the mic and adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. His hands were stiff from gripping it too tightly, his shoulders tense from hunching forward to peer through the windshield. He made a conscious effort to relax, rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers. Getting tense made you drive worse, made you overcorrect and second-guess yourself. He needed to stay calm, stay focused, and get through this mist bank. Once he reached Marquette, he could stop, take a break, wait for conditions to improve before continuing west toward Wisconsin. The next wave of mist was the thickest yet. It rolled across the highway like a solid wall, completely obliterating everything more than 10 feet in front of his bumper. Wardell's headlights reflected back at him, creating a disorienting white glare that made it even harder to see. He slowed to 25 miles per hour, watching the fog line on the right side of the road, using it to keep himself in the lane. This was dangerous. If there was a stopped vehicle ahead, or an animal in the road, or another car doing something unpredictable, he'd have no time to react. But stopping completely wasn't an option either. The shoulder was narrow and there was no safe place to pull off. All he could do was keep creeping forward and hope the visibility improved soon. Something dark loomed up on the right side of the highway. Wardell caught just a glimpse before the mist swirled around it, but it looked like a building. A large building set back from the road, with what might have been a parking lot in front. He was past it before he could process the details, but his mind was already working on the information. A building out here? On this remote stretch of M28? He glanced in his mirror but could see nothing behind him except white mist. The building, whatever it was, had already disappeared. Wardell considered stopping, backing up to investigate, but that seemed like a bad idea in zero visibility. Better to keep moving forward. If it was a rest area or truck stop, there would be signs, lights, some indication of what it was. But as he continued westbound, Wardell realized he hadn't seen any signs. No advance warning that a facility was ahead. No directional markers. Nothing. Just that brief glimpse of a dark structure in the mist. And now that he thought about it, the building had looked odd. Not modern, not the kind of clean metal and glass design you'd expect from a recent construction. It had looked older, more solid, like something built decades ago and left to weather. The mist was starting to thin slightly and Wardell could see maybe 50 yards ahead now. The highway stretched empty in both directions. No other vehicles visible, no buildings, just the road and the forest and the mist rolling in from the invisible lake on his left. His fuel gauge was sitting at just under a quarter tank, lower than Wardell liked to let it get. He'd been planning to fuel up in Marquette, but that was still at least 20 minutes away at his current speed, maybe more if the mist didn't clear. He started thinking about that exit he'd passed, that sign indicating services available. If there was actually a gas station there, it might be worth turning around and checking it out. Getting fuel now would give him more options, more flexibility. He wouldn't have to worry about running low if conditions got worse. Wardell chewed on the inside of his cheek, weighing his choices. Keep pushing forward to Marquette, or turn back and investigate that exit. The decision was made for him when the mist suddenly thickened again, worse than before, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Wardell hit his four-way flashers and slowed to 15 miles per hour, barely crawling. This was insane. He couldn't drive in these conditions. He needed to get off the highway, find somewhere safe to wait it out. And that exit, with its promise of services, was only a few miles behind him. Wardell checked his mirrors, saw nothing but white, and carefully began to slow even further. There was no turnaround here, no median crossover, but the highway was completely empty. If he was careful, if he used his flashers and checked thoroughly, he could turn the truck around and head back to that exit. It took him 5 minutes to execute a safe turnaround, using the full width of the highway and part of the shoulder on both sides. Any truck driver watching would have winced at the maneuver, but Wardell was careful, taking his time, making sure his trailer tandems were positioned correctly. When he finally had the truck pointing eastbound back the way he'd come, the mist had thinned just enough to let him see the road ahead. He put the transmission in gear and started back, watching for the exit sign, watching for that dark building he'd glimpsed. His CB radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. A voice came through, male and distorted by static. Westbound traffic be advised. M28 is closing east of Marquette due to visibility. Do not attempt. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by silence. Wardell grabbed the microphone. "Say again, I didn't copy your full transmission. Are they closing M28? No response. He tried again, switching to Channel 9, the emergency channel. Still nothing. The radio had gone completely dead, not even static now, as if someone had unplugged it. Wardell tapped the unit, checked the power connection, but everything looked fine. The radio was on, the display was lit up, but no sound was coming through. He switched back to Channel 19 and heard nothing. Back to Channel 9, same thing. The radio was dead, which meant he was driving into this mist with no way to communicate, no way to hear warnings or reports from other drivers or authorities. The exit appeared sooner than he expected, emerging from the mist like something materializing from thin air. The sign was there, the same green highway sign with symbols for gas, food, and lodging. But now that Wardell was looking at it more carefully, he noticed details that bothered him. The sign was old, the reflective surface dulled by years of weather, the metal frame showing rust at the edges. The symbols were in an older style too, not the modern standardized designs used on current highway signs. This sign looked like it had been standing here for 30 or 40 years, which didn't match with his memory of this area. He'd driven M28 dozens of times and he'd never seen this exit before. But he needed fuel, and he needed to get off the road, and this was his only option. Wardell took the exit, his truck rumbling down the narrow ramp into what looked like increasingly dense forest. The pavement under his wheels was definitely older, cracked and patched, with weeds growing through the gaps. The ramp curved to the right and descended, and Wardell had the odd sensation of driving down into something, like the exit was leading him below ground level even though the terrain looked flat. The mist was thinner here, blocked somewhat by the trees, and he could see better. Ahead of him the ramp ended at a T intersection, and beyond that he could make out buildings. It was a rest area, or had been once. A main building sat at the center, 2 stories tall, built in a style that looked distinctly 1970s. Brown brick, narrow windows, a flat roof with a slight overhang. To the left was what appeared to be a service station, with old-style gas pumps under a canopy. To the right were several parking spaces, and beyond those a picnic area with tables and what might have been restrooms. Everything was there. Everything you'd expect from a highway rest stop, but everything was wrong. The building looked abandoned, windows dark, no lights visible anywhere. The gas station pumps were old, the kind Wardell remembered from his childhood, tall and narrow with the price displays on top. And there were no other vehicles anywhere. No cars, no trucks, nothing. Wardell brought his truck to a stop at the T intersection and sat there with the engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to turn around, get back on M28, push through to Marquette despite the mist. But his fuel gauge was sitting at a quarter tank, and the logical part of his mind said he should at least check if the gas station was operational. Maybe it was one of those automated places, card reader pumps that didn't need an attendant. Maybe the building was dark because it was late afternoon and no one was using the facilities. There could be perfectly reasonable explanations for everything he was seeing. Wardell put the truck in gear and turned left toward the gas station. As he pulled up alongside the pumps, details became clearer and his unease deepened. The pumps weren't just old, they were ancient. Mechanical meters instead of digital displays. Prices posted in hand-painted numbers that read 79 cents per gallon. Wardell knew gas prices fluctuated, but they hadn't been 79 cents in his lifetime. These pumps hadn't been updated in decades, maybe hadn't been used in decades. He climbed down from his cab and approached the nearest pump, looking for some indication that it was still functional. The hoses were cracked, the metal nozzle corroded. When he tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. The pump was dead, had been dead for years. Wardell stepped back and looked around the rest area. In the improving light with the mist thinning, he could see more details. The picnic tables were weathered gray, some of them collapsed. The trash cans were rusted through. The restroom building had a padlocked door with a faded sign that read, "Closed." This place had been abandoned long ago, probably decades. So why had there been a highway sign indicating services available? Why had that sign looked relatively new, or at least maintained, while everything here was falling apart? Wardell walked toward the main building, his boots crunching on gravel that was being slowly consumed by moss and grass. The main building had large windows across the front, the kind that would have looked into a restaurant or visitor center. Wardell cupped his hands against the glass and peered inside. What he saw made his breath catch. The interior wasn't empty. It was furnished, set up like a functioning rest-stop restaurant. Tables with chairs, a counter with stools, display cases that looked like they still held food. But everything was covered in dust, thick layers of it, and there were cobwebs strung across every surface. More disturbing were the details. Place settings on some of the tables, as if people had been eating there and just walked away mid-meal. A coat hanging on a rack by the door, slowly being consumed by mildew. A newspaper spread out on the counter, its headline too faded to read but the date visible. August 17th, 1979. Wardell stepped back from the window, his heart pounding. This place had been closed since 1979, over 40 years ago. But someone had been maintaining the highway sign, keeping it visible, directing travelers here. Why? He turned and looked back toward the exit ramp, half expecting to see it had disappeared, but it was still there, a dark gap in the trees. He could leave right now, get back on M28, forget about this place. But something held him there, some combination of curiosity and confusion. If this rest area had been closed for over 40 years, why did it look like people had just walked away from it? Why wasn't it completely stripped and vandalized? How had it remained so preserved, so frozen in time? He walked along the front of the building, looking for another entrance, and found a door marked "Office, Staff Only." The door was unlocked, the knob turning easily under his hand. Wardell pushed it open and peered inside. A short hallway, more doors leading off it, dim light filtering through dusty windows. He shouldn't go in there, he knew. This was trespassing. And more than that, it felt wrong. Felt like violating something that should be left alone. But his hand was already pushing the door wider, his feet already carrying him across the threshold into the building. The air inside was cold, cold enough that his breath fogged, and it smelled of dust and decay and something else. Something that reminded him of the lake, of wet stone and deep water. The hallway led to what looked like a manager's office. More newspapers on the desk, all from 1979. A calendar on the wall turned to August with several dates circled in red marker. Photographs in frames showing the rest stop in its prime, cars and trucks from the 70s filling the parking lot, families at the picnic tables. Wardell picked up one of the newspapers and scanned the headline. Upper Peninsula braces for early winter storm. The article below talked about an unusual weather system moving in from Canada, bringing unseasonably cold temperatures and the potential for heavy snow. Strange to read about winter storms in an August paper, but Michigan weather was notoriously unpredictable. A sound from deeper in the building made Wardell freeze. A creak, like footsteps on old floorboards. He listened, barely breathing, but heard nothing more. Just the building settling, he told himself. Old structures made noise, but his skin was crawling, and every survival instinct he possessed was screaming at him to get out. Wardell set down the newspaper and walked quickly back toward the entrance. As he reached the door, he heard the sound again, closer this time. Definitely footsteps, and they were coming from the direction of the restaurant. Someone was in the building with him. Wardell didn't wait to see who it was. He pushed through the door and walked quickly toward his truck, forcing himself not to run. Running would make him look foolish if this was just a security guard or maintenance worker. But when he reached his truck and climbed into the cab, when he looked back at the building, he saw a figure standing in one of the windows. Too far away and too backlit to make out details, but definitely a person standing motionless and watching him. Wardell started his engine and put the truck in gear, backing away from the gas pumps. The figure in the window didn't move, didn't wave, didn't react at all, just stood there watching as Wardell turned his truck around and headed back toward the exit ramp. As he drove up the ramp toward M28, Wardell glanced in his mirror one last time. The rest area was disappearing into the mist behind him, the buildings fading into white, and for just a moment he thought he saw more figures. Several of them standing in the parking lot, standing by the picnic tables, all facing his direction, all watching him leave. Then the mist swallowed everything and he was back on the exit ramp, climbing up toward the highway. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel and his heart was racing. What had he just experienced? An abandoned rest stop that looked like it had been closed for 40 years, yet somehow preserved as if it had just been locked up yesterday. And those figures, were they real? Security guards? Squatters using the abandoned building? Or something else? The exit ramp delivered him back onto M28, and Wardell turned westbound again, back toward Marquette. The mist had thinned considerably while he'd been at the rest area, and he could now see several hundred yards ahead. The visibility was still poor, but manageable, and he pushed his speed up to 50 miles per hour, wanting to put distance between himself and that exit. He drove for 20 minutes without seeing any other vehicles, the highway completely empty, and when he finally saw the lights of Marquette ahead, he felt relief wash through him. Civilization, people, normalcy. He could fuel up, grab some food, maybe ask some locals about that rest area, and find out what its story was. But even as he saw the first buildings of Marquette appearing through the thinning mist, Wardell couldn't shake the image of those figures standing in the parking lot. Couldn't forget how the rest area had looked frozen in time, preserved like something in a museum. And he couldn't stop wondering about that newspaper headline about an early winter storm in August 1979, about what might have happened at that rest stop that caused it to be abandoned so suddenly that people left their meals half-eaten and their coats on the rack. Something had happened there. Something that made them leave in a hurry. And Wardell had a growing suspicion that whatever it was, it had never really ended. The truck stop on the western edge of Marquette was exactly what Wardell needed. Bright, fluorescent lights, the smell of diesel and coffee, other trucks parked in neat rows with their engines idling. Normal things, real things. He pulled into an empty spot and sat there for a moment with his own engine running, just letting the familiar sounds and sights wash over him. Through the windows of the main building he could see people moving around, truck drivers getting coffee, a clerk behind the register. Everything was solid and present and undeniably real, and Wardell felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He climbed down from his cab and headed inside, the bells on the door jingling as he pushed through. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the combined scent of hot dogs on rollers, burnt coffee, and that indefinable truck stop smell that was the same everywhere from Maine to California. A woman behind the counter looked up as he approached, her name tag reading Eunice. She was maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of face that suggested she'd been working this counter for decades. "Evening," she said with a practiced smile. "Cold one out there tonight. What can I get you?" Wardell ordered coffee and asked about fueling up. Eunice directed him to the pumps outside and rang up his coffee, making small talk about the weather, and the mist that had been rolling off the lake all day. "Worst I've seen it in years," she said. "Had a couple of trucks come through earlier saying they could barely see the road. State Patrol's been advising people to wait it out if they can." Wardell nodded, wrapping his hands around the hot coffee cup. "Speaking of the road," he said, trying to keep his tone casual, "is there a rest area east of here? Maybe 15, 20 miles? I thought I saw an exit sign, but I don't remember there being anything out that way." Eunice's expression changed, the professional smile fading into something more guarded. "East on M28? No, there's nothing between here and Munising except trees. Why, did you see something?" Wardell described the exit, the sign indicating services, the rest area he'd found. As he talked, Eunice's face grew more still, more closed off, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "You went to the old Lakeview rest stop." It wasn't a question. "Yeah, that place has been closed since I was a kid. State shut it down in '79 after what happened there." Wardell leaned forward. "What happened?" Eunice glanced around the truck stop, checking to see who might be listening, then lowered her voice. "There was a storm. Early winter storm. Came through in late August, which was weird enough by itself. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in a few hours. Wind coming off Superior like the lake was breathing ice. That lake effect mist you drove through today? That was nothing compared to what hit that night. The mist was so thick people said it was like driving through milk, and it was freezing as it touched everything. Turned the roads into skating rinks in minutes." She paused, staring down at her hands. "There were maybe 30, 40 people at the rest stop when the storm hit. Travelers who'd pulled off to wait it out. Truckers like yourself, a few families." She took a breath before continuing. "They say the temperature inside the building dropped so fast the pipes froze and burst. Power went out. People were trapped there in the dark with no heat, and outside the mist was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Some folks tried to leave, tried to drive out or walk to the highway for help. None of them made it. They found their cars later, some of them just a few yards from the building, frozen solid with people still inside." Eunice's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. When the storm cleared the next morning and emergency crews finally got there, the rest stop was empty. Completely empty. No bodies, no survivors, nothing. Just meals left half-eaten on the tables, coats on the racks, cars in the parking lot with the keys still in them. Everybody who'd been there just vanished. Wardell felt cold despite the warmth of the truck stop. Vanished? How many people? Eunice shrugged. Official count was never released, but local talk put it at around 40 people. The state launched an investigation, brought in search and rescue, even dragged parts of the lake thinking maybe people had wandered out onto the ice and fallen through. Never found a single body. After a few months, they gave up looking and just closed the place down, locked it up, stopped maintaining it, took it off the official highway maps. But they left the sign up, some people say, as a warning. Others say it was just bureaucratic oversight, that someone forgot to take it down. She looked directly at Wardell. "You said you went inside the building?" Wardell nodded slowly. "Found the office. Saw newspapers from August 1979, just like you said. And I saw someone, or thought I did. Figures in the windows, in the parking lot." Eunice's eyes widened. "You saw them? Jesus. Most people who find that place just turn around and leave. The few who've gone inside, who've seen the figures, they all say the same thing. That it felt like the building was still occupied. Like whatever happened that night in '79 is still happening. Like those people are still there, trapped in that storm, waiting for help that never comes." She crossed herself, a quick unconscious gesture. "My advice? Forget you ever saw that place. Don't go back there. Don't talk about it too much. Just forget it exists. But Wardell couldn't forget. He fueled his truck and got back on the road, continuing west toward Wisconsin, but his mind kept returning to the rest area, to those figures standing in the parking lot watching him leave, to the preserved interior of the building, frozen in time like a photograph, and to Eunice's story about 40 people vanishing in a single night during an impossible storm. As he drove through the darkness, the mist mostly cleared now, Wardell found himself looking for information on his phone during a fuel stop near Lands. He searched for Lakeview Rest Area 1979 disappearance and found almost nothing. A few mentions in local history forums, some speculation on paranormal websites, but no official records, no news archives, nothing substantial. It was as if the event had been deliberately erased from history, scrubbed from the records and left to fade into local legend. But the rest area was real. Wardell had been there, had walked through it, had seen the evidence with his own eyes. He tried a different search, looking for Lake Superior Storm, August 1979, and this time got more results. Weather reports from that period mentioning an unusual cold front and unseasonable temperatures. A brief mention in a maritime log about freighters seeking shelter from extreme localized conditions. But nothing about the rest area, nothing about missing people. The absence of information was almost more disturbing than finding details would have been. Someone had decided this story shouldn't be told. Wardell delivered his load in Ashland the next morning and picked up a return shipment heading back east, a load of lumber destined for Sault Ste. Marie. The route would take him back along M28, back past that exit where the rest area waited in the trees. He could take an alternate route, swing south through Wisconsin and come up into the UP from a different direction. But that would add hours to his trip. And more than that, Wardell realized he wanted to see the place again, wanted to confirm that it was real, that he hadn't imagined or misremembered what he'd found there. He spent the day resting in Ashland, catching up on sleep, and tried not to think about what Eunice had told him. 40 people vanishing without a trace. A storm that came from nowhere and created conditions impossible for late August. A building frozen in time for over 40 years. He left Ashland just after sunset, timing his trip so he'd reach the area around the rest stop in full darkness. He told himself it was just coincidence, just the way the schedule worked out, but he knew that wasn't true. He wanted to see the place at night, wanted to see if it looked different, if those figures would be there again. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional car or truck passing in the opposite direction, their headlights creating brief moments of glare before disappearing into the darkness. The mist was back, not as thick as the previous day but still present, rolling across the road in waves that forced Wardell to slow down and navigate carefully. Mile markers counted down as he approached the location where he remembered the exit being. 15 miles east of Marquette. 14 miles, 13. Wardell found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter, his eyes scanning the right side of the highway for that green sign. And there it was, emerging from the mist exactly where it had been before. The same weathered sign, the same symbols for gas and food and lodging. Wardell slowed down, put on his turn signal even though there was no one behind him, and took the exit. The ramp descended into the trees, the pavement cracked and overgrown, and Wardell felt like he was driving into the past, into a pocket of time that existed separate from the present. The rest area appeared ahead, and Wardell's breath caught. The place was lit, not brightly, but there were lights on in the main building, warm yellow lights spilling from the windows. The gas station canopy had lights too, and the parking lot lights were working, casting pools of illumination across the cracked pavement. And there were vehicles, maybe a dozen of them, cars and trucks from what looked like the 1970s, parked in neat rows, as if their owners were inside having a meal or using the restrooms. Wardell brought his truck to a stop at the entrance to the parking lot, his heart pounding. This wasn't possible. Yesterday the place had been dark and abandoned. Now it looked operational, looked like a functioning rest stop from 45 years ago. He sat there for a long moment, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every rational part of his brain screamed that he should turn around and leave, get back on M28 and forget he'd ever seen this place. But curiosity and something else, something that felt almost like obligation, pulled him forward. He put the truck in gear and crept into the parking lot, finding a space away from the other vehicles. Up close, he could see that the cars and trucks were all from the 70s, just as he'd thought. A Chevrolet Impala, a Ford station wagon, a couple of big rigs that looked like they belonged in a trucking museum. All of them in remarkably good condition, no rust, no damage, as if they'd been preserved perfectly for decades. Wardell climbed down from his cab and approached the main building. Through the windows he could see people inside. They were sitting at tables, standing at the counter, moving around in ways that suggested normalcy and life. But something was wrong with the way they moved. Something Wardell couldn't quite define. Their movements were slightly off, slightly too slow or too smooth, like watching footage played back at the wrong speed. He reached the entrance and pulled open the door, and warmth and sound washed over him. Conversation, the clink of dishes, the hiss of a coffee maker, the smell of hamburgers cooking and cigarette smoke. Inside, the rest stop looked exactly as it must have in 1979. Avocado green countertops, orange vinyl booth seats, wood-paneled walls. The people were dressed in styles from that era, bell-bottom jeans and wide-collared shirts, long hair and sideburns. A waitress moved between tables with a coffee pot, refilling cups. A family sat in one booth, children coloring on placemats while their parents looked at a road map. Everything looked normal, lived in, real. Except no one was looking at Wardell. No one had turned when he entered. No one seemed to notice a modern truck driver in a down jacket standing in the doorway. He was invisible to them, or they were so absorbed in their own existence that they couldn't perceive him. Wardell walked slowly into the restaurant, and the sounds changed quality. The conversations became hollow, echoing, as if they were happening in a much larger space than this small building. He could hear individual words now, fragments of dialogue. A man talking about the weather, saying the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour. A woman saying they should wait it out, that the roads would be too dangerous to drive. A truck driver at the counter saying he'd never seen mist like this, that it was like the lake was trying to swallow the whole peninsula. They were talking about the storm, about the night in 1979 when 40 people vanished. And Wardell realized with growing horror that he was watching that night play out, seeing the hours before the disappearance as if it was still happening. A television mounted in the corner was showing what looked like a news broadcast from 1979, a weatherman standing in front of a map of the Great Lakes region. The audio was distorted, but Wardell could make out phrases. Unusual low-pressure system. Temperatures falling rapidly. Extreme caution advised. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read August 17, 1979, 8:47 p.m. Wardell looked at his watch. The date on his digital display read December 19th, current year. But the broadcast was showing August 17, 1979. Time was wrong here. Or rather, time was doubled. Two periods existing simultaneously in the same space. He walked through the restaurant, and the people continued to ignore him. Or maybe they couldn't see him. Maybe he was the ghost here, the visitor from the future intruding on their final hours. Wardell reached the counter and looked at the food under the heat lamps. Hamburgers, hot dogs, fries. All of it looked fresh, hot, recently cooked. But when he reached out to touch one of the plates, his hand passed through it as if the food wasn't really there. It was an image, a recording, a memory of food that had existed decades ago. Everything here was like that, he realized. Real enough to see and hear, but not substantial enough to touch. Except the building itself, that had been solid. He'd walked through it, touched the newspapers, felt the cold air. The door to the rest stop opened and more people entered. A family with 3 children. They were talking urgently, the father saying they needed to get off the road before the storm got worse. The mother was carrying a small child who was crying, upset by the sudden cold and the frightening weather. They found a booth and sat down, and the waitress brought them menus and coffee. Wardell watched them. Watched the father trying to comfort his children, telling them everything would be fine. They'd wait out the storm and be back on the road in the morning. But Wardell knew that wouldn't happen, knew that these people would never leave this building, would vanish along with everyone else when the storm reached its peak. He wanted to warn them, wanted to tell them to get back in their car and drive, take their chances on the highway rather than staying here. But he knew it was pointless. This wasn't really happening. This was a recording, a loop, the past playing over and over in this space that had somehow become unstuck from normal time. Wardell walked toward the back of the restaurant, toward a hallway that led to the restrooms and what looked like a rear exit. The sounds behind him were fading, becoming more distant and hollow, and he could feel the temperature dropping. The warmth of the restaurant was an illusion, he realized. The real temperature here was much colder. The hallway was darker, the fluorescent lights flickering. Wardell could see his breath now, white clouds forming with each exhalation. The walls were developing a thin coating of frost, ice crystals spreading in delicate patterns across the wood paneling. He was seeing the storm arrive, seeing what had happened in the hours before the disappearance. The rear exit door was partially open, and through the gap, Wardell could see the parking lot. The mist was rolling in, thicker than anything he'd encountered the previous day, so dense it looked almost solid. And it was moving wrong, not drifting randomly but flowing in deliberate patterns, as if it had intention, as if it was seeking something. Wardell pushed the door open wider and stepped out into the parking lot. The cold hit him like a physical blow, so intense it drove the air from his lungs. The temperature had to be below 0, maybe well below, and the mist was freezing as it touched surfaces coating everything in ice. The vehicles in the parking lot were already encased, their windows frosted over, ice building up on the bodies and wheels. And in the mist, moving through it, Wardell saw figures. Not the people from inside the restaurant, but something else. Shapes that were almost human but not quite. Tall and thin and moving with that same wrong quality he'd noticed in the restaurant patrons. They were walking between the vehicles, peering into windows, and wherever they moved, the ice grew thicker. One of the figures turned toward Wardell, and he got a glimpse of what might have been a face. Pale, featureless, like a mask of ice. No expression, no eyes or mouth. Just a blank surface that somehow suggested awareness. The figure began moving toward him, and Wardell backed up, fumbling for the door handle. More figures were appearing in the mist, emerging from the direction of the lake, drawn by something Wardell couldn't understand. They surrounded the rest stop, and as he watched in horror, they began to reach toward the building, toward the people inside who were still eating and talking, and completely unaware of what was coming for them. Wardell yanked the door open and stumbled back inside, slamming it shut behind him. The restaurant was still there, still lit and warm and full of people, but even as he watched, the lights began to flicker. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the people were starting to notice. The conversations changed tone, became worried, frightened. Someone said the power was going out. Someone else said the doors were frozen shut. They couldn't get them open. Panic was beginning to spread, and Wardell knew he was about to witness the final moments before the disappearance. He didn't want to see it. Didn't want to watch these people, these ghosts, experience whatever horror had claimed them in 1979. Wardell ran toward the front entrance, pushing past people who couldn't see him, couldn't feel him. He hit the front door and it swung open easily, and he burst out into the parking lot. The mist was everywhere now, the ice figures moving through it in greater numbers, converging on the building. Behind him, he could hear screaming starting, could hear the terrified voices of people trapped in a nightmare they didn't understand. Wardell ran to his truck and climbed into the cab, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine started and he threw the truck into gear, pulling out of the parking lot without checking his mirrors, without caring if he hit anything. He just needed to get away from the rest stop, away from those figures in the mist, away from the screams that were still echoing from inside the building. The exit ramp appeared ahead, and he took it fast, the truck's wheels slipping on ice that had formed while he'd been inside. He fought the wheel, corrected the slide, and powered up onto M28. Behind him, the rest stop was disappearing into the mist again, the lights fading, and Wardell could have sworn he heard a sound like wind or waves or voices all mixed together, rising to a crescendo before cutting off abruptly. He drove west toward Marquette, pushing his speed higher than he should have, desperate to put distance between himself and that place. The mist on the highway was thinner than it had been in the parking lot, and visibility improved as he got further from the exit. His CB radio crackled to life suddenly, making him jump. A voice came through, female and distorted. Eastbound traffic approaching Lakeview Rest Area. Be advised of extreme weather conditions. Storm moving in from the lake. Seek shelter immediately. Repeat, seek shelter immediately. The voice sounded automated, like a recording, and it was speaking in the present tense about conditions from 1979. Wardell grabbed the microphone with a shaking hand. This is westbound Pritchard on M28. That storm you're warning about happened 40 years ago. There's no shelter at Lakeview. The place is... It's not real, it's a trap. Silence. Then, the same recorded message began again. Eastbound traffic approaching Lakeview Rest Area. Wardell hung up the mic and switched off the CB radio. He didn't want to hear that voice anymore. Didn't want to know if it was really a recording or something else. Some echo of the past trying to lure more travelers to the abandoned rest stop. The lights of Marquette appeared ahead, and Wardell pulled into the same truck stop where he'd talked to Eunice. It was after midnight now, a different clerk behind the counter, but Wardell bought coffee anyway and sat in one of the booths, his hands wrapped around the cup, trying to stop shaking. He'd seen it. He'd seen what happened to those people, or at least the beginning of it. Those ice figures emerging from the mist, surrounding the building, trapping everyone inside. But what were they? What had caused them to appear? And where had the people gone when they disappeared? Wardell pulled out his phone and tried searching for more information, but the results were the same as before. Nothing solid, nothing official. He tried a different approach, searching for Lake Superior ice phenomena and freezing mist entities. Most of the results were scientific articles about ice formation and weather patterns, but buried in the search results was a link to an old maritime forum. Wardell opened it and found a thread from 2003 where sailors were discussing strange experiences on Lake Superior. One post caught his attention. A sailor describing a night in the late 1970s when his freighter had encountered impossibly thick mist that seemed to have shapes moving through it, shapes that looked almost human but wrong somehow. The sailor went on to describe how the mist had frozen everything it touched, how the temperature had dropped so fast that several crew members had gotten frostbite just from being on deck for a few minutes. And then he mentioned something that made Wardell's blood run cold. We could hear voices in the mist, people calling for help, but when we tried to locate them with searchlights, we couldn't see anyone. Just shapes moving through the ice fog. The captain ordered everyone below decks, and we ran at full speed until we were clear of the area. When we checked the charts later, we realized we'd been just offshore from an old rest stop on M28. Found out later that place had closed down around that same time, some kind of incident they never publicized. So it wasn't just the rest stop. The phenomenon, whatever it was, had been noticed by others. By sailors on Superior, by people who'd encountered the strange mist and the figures within it. Wardell kept reading, finding more posts, more stories. A pattern emerged. The sightings always happened in late fall or early winter, always involved the thick lake effect mist, and always seemed to be concentrated along certain sections of the coastline. The area around the old Lakeview rest stop was mentioned multiple times. It was as if that location had become a focal point for whatever was happening, a place where the boundary between normal and abnormal had worn thin. Wardell finished his coffee and walked back to his truck. He still had hours of driving ahead of him before he reached Sault Ste. Marie, and all of it would be along M28, along the coast where the mist could roll in at any time. He climbed into his cab and sat there, staring at the dashboard, trying to decide what to do. He could call his dispatcher, claim mechanical problems, wait for daylight before continuing. But daylight wouldn't necessarily help. The mist could appear any time, day or night. And those figures, those ice shapes that had surrounded the rest stop, they didn't seem to care about the position of the sun. No, running wouldn't solve anything. Wardell had already seen too much, already knew too much. The only way forward was to complete his route, deliver his load, and then decide whether to ever drive this stretch of highway again. He started the engine and pulled back onto M28, heading east now, toward Munising and eventually Sault Ste. Marie. The night was dark, and the mist came and went in waves, but Wardell kept his speed moderate, his attention focused, and tried not to think about what he'd witnessed at the rest stop, tried not to imagine those 40 people trapped in their final moments, experiencing that freezing nightmare over and over for 45 years. But as he drove through the darkness, as the miles rolled past and the forests pressed close on either side, Wardell couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something from the rest stop had attached itself to him, was trailing behind his truck through the mist. Every time he checked his mirrors, he half expected to see those pale ice figures standing on the highway, watching him pass. Every time the mist thickened, he tensed, waiting for shapes to emerge from it. And when his CB radio crackled with static, when that recorded warning voice began speaking again, Wardell reached over and turned the radio off completely. He didn't need warnings anymore. He knew the danger was real. Wardell made it to Munising around 3 a.m., pulling into a small diesel stop on the eastern edge of town. The mist had thinned to almost nothing here, the air clear and cold, stars visible overhead for the first time in 2 days. He fueled the truck and went inside for more coffee, his third or fourth cup of the night, losing count now. The exhaustion was starting to catch up with him, the adrenaline from the rest stop experience fading and leaving him hollow and shaky. He knew he should stop, get a few hours of sleep before attempting the final stretch to Sault Ste. Marie, but he didn't want to close his eyes, didn't want to risk dreaming about what he'd seen. The clerk at the Munising fuel stop was a young guy, maybe 25, with the bored expression of someone working the graveyard shift. He rang up Wardell's coffee without much interest, but when Wardell asked about road conditions east toward the Sioux, the clerk's demeanor changed. "You're heading east? Tonight?" Wardell nodded. "Got a delivery schedule to keep." The clerk shook his head slowly. Might want to reconsider that. Mist has been coming and going all week along the coast road. Had a couple of cars go off into the ditches, one semi-jackknifed near Grand Marais. State Patrol's been advising people to stick to the inland routes if possible. Wardell considered this. The inland route would add time and distance, taking him south through Manistique before swinging back north to the Sioux, but it would avoid the coastal sections of M28, would keep him away from the shoreline where the mist rolled in. "How's the weather forecast looking?" he asked. The clerk pulled up something on his phone, scrolling through weather reports. "Says clear for the next 12 hours, but you know how it is up here. Lake Superior makes her own weather. Forecast doesn't mean much when the big lake decides to breathe." That phrase again. The lake breathing. Wardell paid for his coffee and walked back to his truck, weighing his options. He was about to climb into the cab when he noticed something on his windshield. Not ice, not frost, but something else. A pattern, delicate and intricate, drawn in what looked like condensation. Except the pattern was too precise, too deliberate to be random. It showed a road, a curving line that could have been M28, and at one point along the road there was a symbol that looked almost like a warning sign. Wardell reached out to touch it, and the pattern disappeared, evaporating instantly as his finger made contact. He stood there for a moment, staring at the clean windshield, wondering if he'd really seen it or if exhaustion was making him hallucinate. A voice behind him made him turn. "You saw it too, didn't you?" An older man was standing near one of the fuel pumps, filling up a battered pickup truck. He was maybe 70, with a weathered face and the kind of eyes that had seen too much. Wardell didn't pretend to misunderstand. "The rest stop? Yeah, I saw it." The old man nodded slowly. "Figured you had. You got that look. Same look I had back in '85 when I stumbled across that place. Thought I was losing my mind at first, seeing a building that shouldn't exist, full of people who'd been dead for years." He finished fueling and walked over to Wardell. "Name's Nolan Voss. Used to drive tow truck for the county, pulled a lot of cars out of ditches along M28. Saw things that didn't make sense, especially in winter when the mist comes." Wardell introduced himself, and Nolan seemed to relax slightly, as if finding someone else who understood was a relief. "That rest stop, it's not the only strange thing along this stretch of coast," Nolan said. "The whole area, from about Marquette east to Grand Marais, it's got a reputation. Locals know to be careful, especially when the mist rolls in. Something about the way the lake interacts with the land here, the temperature differences, the geology. I don't know the science of it. But things happen here that don't happen other places. Time gets funny. People see things, experience things that can't be explained." He paused. "You planning to keep driving east tonight?" Wardell nodded. "Got a delivery to make." Nolan's expression turned serious. "Then you need to know something. If you see that exit again, if you see the sign for the rest stop, don't take it. No matter how bad the weather gets, no matter how tempting it is to pull off and wait things out, don't go back there. Because every time someone goes, it gets harder to leave. The place wants people, wants to add to the number that disappeared that night. And eventually, if you go back enough times, you won't be able to leave at all. You'll become part of it, part of the loop, stuck in 1979 forever." The way Nolan said it, with absolute conviction, made Wardell's skin crawl. "How do you know this?" Nolan looked away toward the dark expanse of forest beyond the fuel stop. "Because I went back. After my first visit, I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't let it go. So I went back multiple times, trying to understand, trying to document it. And each time it got harder to leave. The last time, I almost didn't make it out. I felt something pulling at me, trying to keep me there. And I barely got to my truck before..." He trailed off, then looked back at Wardell. Before I became one of them. One of the figures in the parking lot watching new visitors arrive, unable to warn them, unable to do anything but watch. Wardell felt cold despite his heavy jacket. But you did get out. Nolan nodded, barely, and I swore I'd never go near that exit again. Haven't driven M28 at night in almost 40 years because of it. Stick to daylight, stick to clear weather, and I've been fine. But you're heading into the worst section right now. Middle of the night, mist likely to come back. You need to be prepared. If you see the exit, if you see the sign, just keep driving. Don't even slow down to look. And if your CB radio starts broadcasting that warning message, turn it off. Don't listen to it. That voice, it's designed to pull you in, to make you think you're helping by going there. They talked for another 20 minutes. Nolan sharing details about his experiences, about other drivers who'd encountered the rest stop over the years. Some had gotten out safely. Others had disappeared, their trucks found abandoned along M28 with no sign of the drivers. The official explanations were always the same. Driver error, wandered off into the woods in confusion, fell through ice. Any number of rational possibilities. But Nolan and the other locals knew the truth. The rest stop was still claiming victims, still adding to the count from that night in 1979. Why does it happen? Wardell asked. What causes it? Nolan shrugged. Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's the lake, that Superior is so big and so cold and so old that it's developed a kind of consciousness, or at least a presence. Others say it's geological, some kind of magnetic anomaly that affects time and space. My personal theory? I think those people who disappeared in '79, I think they're trapped in the moment of their deaths, and they're trying to reach out, trying to find a way back to the living world. And the only way they can do that is by pulling new people in to take their places. It was a grim theory, and it made a horrible kind of sense. Wardell thanked Nolan for the information and climbed into his truck. As he started the engine, Nolan walked over one more time. One last thing, the old man said. If the mist gets really thick, if you can't see more than a few feet ahead, pull over and wait it out. Don't try to push through. That's when it's most dangerous, when the boundary is thinnest. And if you hear voices, people calling for help, don't investigate. Just stay in your truck with the doors locked until the mist clears. Wardell promised to be careful and pulled out of the fuel stop, pointing his truck east along M28. The highway was empty at this hour, just Wardell's headlights cutting through the darkness. The forest pressed close on both sides, dense stands of pine and birch that blocked any view of the lake to his left. Mile markers counted upward as he drove, and Wardell found himself tense every time he passed one, waiting for that exit sign to appear. Nolan's warnings echoed in his mind. Don't take the exit, don't listen to the voice, don't investigate if you hear people calling for help. Simple instructions, but Wardell knew from experience how hard they could be to follow when you were actually in the moment, when instinct and training told you to help people in trouble. Around 4:30 a.m., about halfway to Grand Marais, Wardell noticed the temperature dropping. His dashboard thermometer showed it had gone from 20 degrees to 15 to 10 in the space of a few miles. And with the temperature drop came the mist, rolling in from the lake, thinner than before but still enough to reduce visibility. Wardell slowed to 40, then 35, watching the fog line, staying alert for any changes in road conditions. The mist had a quality to it tonight that he didn't like, a thickness that seemed to muffle sound, that made his headlights reflect back in strange ways. His CB radio crackled to life even though he'd turned it off hours ago. That same automated voice, that same warning message. Eastbound traffic approaching Lakeview Rest Area. Be advised of extreme weather conditions. Wardell reached over and physically unplugged the radio from its power source, but the voice continued, now coming from the speaker even though there was no power. Storm moving in from the lake. Seek shelter immediately. It wasn't possible. The radio had no power. The voice shouldn't be able to broadcast. But it was there, clear and insistent, and Wardell felt panic rising in his chest. He was reaching for the radio to physically disconnect the speaker when he saw lights ahead. Red taillights, multiple vehicles stopped in the road. Wardell hit his brakes, the anti-lock system pulsing as he slowed rapidly. The truck came to a stop about 50 yards behind the other vehicles, and Wardell could see now that it was a pile-up. 3 or 4 cars at least, one of them turned sideways across both lanes, another in the ditch on the right side. Hazard lights were flashing, but no emergency vehicles were present yet. And in the mist beyond the accident, Wardell could see figures moving. People getting out of their cars, walking around, checking on each other. He should stop. Should check if anyone was injured, if anyone needed help. It was what any decent person would do, what his training as a professional driver demanded. Wardell put his truck in park and was about to open the door when something made him hesitate. The way the people were moving. It was wrong, just like at the rest stop, that same too slow, too smooth quality. And the cars involved in the accident, now that he looked at them more carefully, they were old. Not classic cars maintained in good condition, but old cars with styling from the 1970s and 1980s. A Chevrolet Nova, a Plymouth Velar, a Ford Granada. Cars that had been off the roads for decades. Wardell's hand froze on the door handle. This wasn't a real accident. This was another echo, another loop playing out from the past. And if he got out of his truck, if he walked over to help, he might become part of it, might get pulled into whatever time-displaced nightmare was unfolding here. He put the truck back in gear and carefully backed up, giving himself room to turn around. The figures in the mist turned to watch him, their faces pale and indistinct, and one of them raised a hand as if gesturing for him to stop, to help. But Wardell kept backing up until he had enough space to execute a turnaround. As he swung the truck around, pointing it back west, Wardell caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. More vehicles were appearing in the mist behind the accident, old cars and trucks materializing out of the white, adding to the pile-up. And the figures were multiplying too, more people emerging from the mist, all of them moving toward the road, all of them converging on the spot where Wardell had been stopped. They were trying to create a barrier, trying to trap him the way they'd been trapped. Wardell accelerated away from the scene, watching in his mirrors as the whole tableau faded back into the mist, until he couldn't tell if it had ever really been there. He drove west for 10 miles before pulling onto a wide spot on the shoulder. His hands were shaking too badly to drive safely, and his mind was reeling from what he'd just seen. The accident, the old cars, the figures in the mist. It was spreading, he realized. The phenomenon wasn't confined to the rest stop anymore. It was bleeding out along the highway, creating pockets of displaced time where the past kept playing out over and over. Wardell sat there in the darkness, engine running, trying to calm his breathing and figure out what to do next. His phone had no signal, unsurprising this far from any cell towers. His CB radio was still broadcasting that warning message even though it was unplugged, the voice now sounding more urgent, more insistent. Wardell grabbed the entire radio unit and yanked it out of its mounting, disconnecting all the cables, but the voice continued, now seeming to come from the air itself, from the mist outside his truck. He couldn't escape it, couldn't shut it out. The phenomenon was all around him now, surrounding his truck, and he was trapped on a highway that seemed to be dissolving into the past. A tapping on his window made him jump. Wardell turned and saw a figure standing outside his driver's side door. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing clothing from the 1970s. and her face had that same pale, indistinct quality as the figures at the rest stop. She was tapping on the glass, her mouth moving as if speaking, but Wardell couldn't hear any sound. He watched in horror as she raised her hand and began writing something on the foggy window glass. Letters appeared, traced backwards so he could read them from inside. "Help us." More figures appeared around his truck, surrounding it, all of them with that same pale, pleading look. They pressed their hands against the windows, against the sides of the trailer, and Wardell could feel the truck rocking slightly from their touch. They were real enough to create physical force, solid enough to trap him if he let them. Wardell threw the transmission into gear and hit the accelerator, and the truck lurched forward. The figures scattered, or seemed to, their forms dissipating like fog as the truck passed through them. But in his mirrors, Wardell could see them reforming, gathering again, and more were emerging from the mist to join them. He drove faster than he should have given the visibility, pushing 50 and then 60, desperate to outrun whatever was pursuing him. The mist seemed to be chasing him now, billowing along behind his truck, keeping pace no matter how fast he went. And in that mist, Wardell could see shapes, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all of the people who'd vanished along this stretch of coast over the years. They were all still here, trapped in the space between then and now, unable to move on, unable to rest. And they wanted company, wanted to pull the living into their eternal loop. Wardell saw lights ahead and felt relief wash through him. The Munising fuel stop, still open, still bright and normal and real. He pulled in too fast, his trailer swinging wide, and brought the truck to a stop near the building. The clerk came to the door, looking concerned, and Wardell jumped down from his cab and ran toward the light. Behind him, the mist was piling up at the edge of the fuel stop parking lot, as if unable or unwilling to cross onto the property. The figures were there too, visible in the white, watching him. But they didn't follow. Inside the fuel stop, Wardell collapsed into a chair, his breathing ragged. The young clerk brought him water and asked if he was okay, if he needed medical attention. Wardell shook his head, unable to speak, unable to explain what he'd just experienced. How could he tell this kid that he'd been chased by ghosts through the mist, that the highway was becoming unstuck in time, that the past was bleeding through into the present? The clerk would think he was crazy, would call the police or an ambulance. So Wardell just sat there, drinking water, watching through the windows as the mist slowly retreated back towards the highway. After 20 minutes, his phone suddenly had signal again, and it rang immediately. His dispatcher, wondering why the truck's GPS had shown him going backward, why he'd deviated from his route. Wardell made up something about dodging an accident, about having to turn around because of road closures. The dispatcher accepted the explanation and told him to get back on schedule. The delivery in Sault Ste. Marie was time-sensitive. Wardell promised to make up the lost time and ended the call. But he knew he couldn't go back out there, not on M28, not through the coastal sections where the mist could appear at any moment. He walked over to the counter where the clerk was restocking cigarettes. Is there an inland route to the Sioux? Something that doesn't follow the lakeshore? The clerk pulled up a map on his phone and showed Wardell an alternate route, heading south through Manistique and then northeast on H63. It would add about 90 minutes to the trip, but would keep him away from Superior's coast entirely. Wardell thanked him and bought more coffee, then walked back to his truck. The mist had retreated completely now, the air clear, but Wardell knew it was just waiting for him to get back on M28, to drive into its embrace. Instead, he took the southern route, following the clerk's directions, putting miles between himself and the coast. The drive was longer, but uneventful, the roads clear. No mist, no figures, no echoes from the past. Wardell delivered his load in Sault Ste. Marie just after noon, apologized for the delay, and immediately called his dispatcher to request different routes for future runs. No more M28. No more coastal highways along Superior. He didn't care if it cost him money or convenience. He was done with that stretch of road. But that night, in a motel room in the Sioux, Wardell couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those figures in the mist, saw that woman writing, "Help us," on his window. They were still out there, still trapped, and he'd done nothing to help them. Couldn't help them. What could anyone do against something like that? Against time itself becoming unstuck, against the past refusing to die. Wardell lay in the darkness, listening to wind off the lake rattling his window, and wondered how many other drivers had experienced what he had. How many had seen the rest stop, had encountered the mist figures, had been chased along that cursed stretch of highway. And he wondered, with growing dread, whether he'd really escaped at all. Whether something from that place had attached itself to him, followed him away from the coast, was even now waiting for the right moment to pull him back. Because that's what Nolan had warned about. The place wanted to add to its collection, wanted to trap more people in its eternal loop. And Wardell had been there twice now, had seen the figures, had heard their pleas for help. He'd made a connection, formed a link, and links could be pulled on from both ends. In the darkness of his motel room, with the wind howling outside and the temperature dropping, Wardell heard something that made his skin crawl. That automated voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere he couldn't identify. Eastbound traffic approaching Lakeview Rest Area. Be advised of extreme weather conditions. Storm moving in from the lake. Seek shelter immediately. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, and realized the voice was coming from his phone. But his phone was off, powered down, sitting on the nightstand. He picked it up and the screen was dark. No power, yet the voice continued emanating from the speaker. Wardell threw the phone across the room and it hit the wall, breaking into pieces. The voice stopped, but in the silence that followed, Wardell could hear something else. Footsteps in the hallway outside his room. Slow footsteps, shuffling, like someone walking in shoes that didn't quite fit. And then a tapping on his door, soft and persistent. The same rhythm as that woman had used on his truck window. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Wardell sat frozen in his bed, staring at the door, watching the shadow of feet visible in the gap beneath it. The tapping continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped and the shadow moved away, and Wardell was alone again. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't over. The rest stop, the mist, the figures trapped in time, they'd marked him, and they wouldn't let him go easily. Wardell didn't sleep that night, just sat in his bed with all the lights on, waiting for dawn, wondering if he'd ever feel safe driving again. Wardell didn't leave Sault Ste. Marie for 3 days. He stayed in that motel room, ordering food delivery, avoiding the windows, trying to convince himself that what he'd experienced had been exhaustion-induced hallucination. The rational part of his mind insisted there had to be logical explanations. Old buildings preserved by cold and dry conditions, squatters living in the abandoned rest stop, his phone malfunctioning due to electromagnetic interference, someone knocking on the wrong motel room door in the middle of the night. All of it could be explained without resorting to supernatural theories. But the rational explanations didn't account for everything. Didn't explain the cars from the 1970s appearing and disappearing in the mist. Didn't explain the figures that had surrounded his truck, solid enough to rock it with their touch, but insubstantial enough to dissipate when he drove through them. Didn't explain how his CB radio continued broadcasting after being physically disconnected from all power sources. and they certainly didn't explain the pattern that kept appearing on surfaces around him. The same symbol he'd seen on his windshield, showing up now on the bathroom mirror, on the motel room window, on the screen of his replacement phone. A road with a warning marker, always the same, always appearing when he wasn't looking. On the fourth day, his dispatcher called, insistent that Wardell needed to get back to work. There were loads waiting, schedules to keep, contracts to fulfill. Wardell tried to explain that he needed time off, that he'd experienced something traumatic on his last run, but the dispatcher wasn't interested in excuses. Either Wardell took the next available load, or the company would find another driver who would. It was the reality of trucking. You were only as valuable as your last delivery, and drivers were replaceable. Wardell needed the job, needed the income, so he agreed to the next run even though every instinct told him it was a mistake. The load was going to Green Bay, a southbound route that would take him down through Wisconsin, well away from Lake Superior's coast. Wardell felt relief when he saw the routing. He could handle this, could get back into the rhythm of driving without having to face M28 again. He picked up the load at a warehouse outside the Sioux and headed south on I-75, then west on US 2. The weather was clear, the roads dry, and for the first 100 miles everything felt normal. Wardell started to relax, started to think maybe he'd overreacted, maybe the worst was behind him. Then, about 20 miles west of St. Ignace, he noticed the temperature dropping. The dashboard thermometer went from 32 degrees to 28 to 23 in the space of a few miles. And with the temperature drop came something else. Mist, rising from the snow-covered fields on either side of the highway, thin at first but thickening rapidly. Wardell's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't lake effect mist. He was too far inland, too far from Superior's shore. But the mist was behaving the same way, rolling in deliberate patterns, obscuring the road in waves. His CB radio, a new unit he'd installed to replace the one he'd destroyed, crackled to life. That voice, that automated warning, now coming through on a frequency he'd never used. Eastbound traffic approaching Lakeview Rest Area. Wardell's stomach dropped. He wasn't eastbound. He was heading west, and he was nowhere near M28. But the warning continued, and as it did, the mist thickened until he could barely see 20 feet ahead. Wardell slowed to a crawl, his four-way flashers on, and tried to keep the truck on the road by following the fog line. Something appeared in the road ahead. Wardell hit his brakes and the truck shuddered to a stop, the anti-lock system pulsing. There, directly in his lane, was a vehicle. Not a modern car, but something from decades ago, a station wagon with wood paneling on the sides, its hazard lights flashing weakly. Wardell sat there, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every lesson from his encounter on M28 told him to turn around, to get away from this situation. But he was on a straight section of highway with no room to turn around, and the mist was so thick he couldn't see what was behind him anymore. A figure emerged from the station wagon. A woman, dressed in clothing from the 1970s, waving for help. Wardell watched through his windshield as she approached his truck, and even from a distance he could see that something was wrong with her movements, that same too smooth quality he'd seen before. She reached his driver's side window and tapped on it, her face pale and indistinct in the mist. Wardell didn't roll down the window, didn't acknowledge her. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, remembering Nolan's warning. Don't investigate. Don't help. Don't engage. The woman's tapping became more insistent, and then she began speaking. Wardell couldn't hear her through the closed window, but he could see her mouth moving, could see the desperation in her gestures. She was pointing back toward the station wagon, pointing at something Wardell couldn't see. Maybe other passengers. Maybe children. The scenario was designed to pull at his conscience to make him want to help, but Wardell kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes forward. This wasn't real. This was the phenomenon spreading, following him away from the coast, trying to trap him the way it had trapped so many others. More figures appeared in the mist around his truck. Men, women, children, all dressed in styles from past decades. They surrounded the cab, pressing their hands against the windows, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Wardell could see their breath fogging the glass, could feel the truck rocking slightly from their touch. They were becoming more solid, more real, and he knew if he didn't do something soon, they would find a way inside. He put the truck in reverse and began backing up slowly. The warning beeps loud in the enclosed cab. The figures scattered but didn't disappear, reforming behind and beside his truck as he moved. Then Wardell saw something that made his decision for him. In the mist ahead, beyond the station wagon, more vehicles were appearing. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, old cars and trucks materializing out of the white. And between them, walking toward his position, were more figures. An army of them, all converging on his location. They were hurting him, Wardell realized, trying to force him off the road, trying to trap him in the mist where time didn't work properly and the past could swallow the present. He couldn't back up far enough to escape them all, and going forward would drive him directly into their midst. Wardell made a split-second decision. He cranked the wheel hard to the right and hit the accelerator, driving off the highway into the snow-covered field beyond. The truck bounced and lurched over the uneven ground, the trailer fishtailing behind him, but he kept the power on and fought the wheel to maintain some semblance of control. Behind him, he could hear metal scraping as the trailer tandems caught on something, but he didn't stop. He just kept driving across the field, praying he wouldn't hit a drainage ditch or a fence post hidden in the snow. The mist seemed to follow him, billowing across the field, and in his mirrors, Wardell could see the figures pursuing. They were running now, their movements becoming faster and more frantic, and the sight of them sprinting through the snow was more terrifying than when they'd been moving slowly. They were losing their facade of humanity, becoming something else, something that moved in ways that no living person could. Wardell pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring, the wheels spinning in the soft snow. He had maybe 100 yards lead on the nearest figures, and it was shrinking. Ahead, he could see lights. A farmhouse, isolated in the middle of the field with a barn and several outbuildings. Wardell aimed for it, hoping the presence of living people might offer some protection from whatever was chasing him. He slid to a stop in the farmyard and jumped from his cab, running toward the house. He pounded on the door, looking back over his shoulder at the mist rolling across the field, at the dark shapes moving within it. The door opened, and an elderly man stood there, shotgun in hand, eyes wide at the sight of an 18-wheeler parked in his yard. "Please," Wardell gasped. "You have to let me in. There's something in the mist, something that's been following me." The farmer looked past Wardell at the approaching white wall, and his expression changed from anger to fear. "Get inside," he said, pulling Wardell through the door. "Quick!" He slammed the door and threw multiple locks, then moved to the windows and began closing heavy wooden shutters that Wardell hadn't noticed before. "You led them here," the farmer said, his voice tight. "You brought them off the highway." Wardell stammered an apology, but the old man shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. They're here. We just have to wait them out." The farmer lived alone, and he knew about the phenomenon. "Been happening for years," he said as they sat in his darkened living room, listening to the wind and the mist pressing against the house. "Started back in '79 with that business at the rest stop, but it's been spreading ever since. Used to be confined to M28, to the coastal sections, but every few years it pushes a little further inland, claims a little more territory. Now it can appear anywhere in the UP when conditions are right. Cold temperatures, heavy mist, and someone who's already been touched by it. He looked at Wardell. "You've been to the rest stop, haven't you? Seen the building?" Wardell nodded, twice. "And I've been trying to avoid it, trying to stay away from that area." The farmer made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. "Doesn't work that way. Once you've seen it, once you've made contact, it can find you anywhere. The mist is like a bridge, connecting all the places where time got broken, and the things trapped in those places can use the bridge to reach out. They're looking for a way back, looking for someone to take their place so they can escape." He stood and peered through a crack in the shutters. "They're circling the house. Won't come inside, not yet. Too much life here, too much present tense reality. But if we were to go outside, they'd take us in a heartbeat." They sat in the darkness for hours, listening to sounds outside that didn't quite match wind or natural movement. Wardell could hear footsteps on the porch, hands sliding across the windows, voices whispering words he couldn't quite make out. His phone, turned off and buried in his jacket pocket, began broadcasting that warning message again. The farmer told him to throw it in the fireplace, and Wardell did, watching the device melt in the flames. But the voice continued, now seeming to come from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the house. "It wants you specifically," the farmer said. "Wants you more than me. I'm old. I've lived my life. But you're younger. You've got years ahead. That makes you valuable to them. A better trade." Wardell asked what he meant, and the farmer explained his theory. "The people who vanished in '79, they're not dead in any normal sense. They're trapped in the moment before death, in the space between living and dying. And the only way they can move forward, can finally die and be released, is if someone takes their place. One life for one life. That's why they keep reaching out, keep trying to pull people in. They need replacements." The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when the sounds outside finally stopped. The farmer risked opening one of the shutters and peered out. The mist had retreated, pulling back across the field toward the highway. The figures were gone, and Wardell's truck sat alone in the farmyard, looking absurdly out of place against the snow in the barn. "You should go now," the farmer said, "while it's light. They're weaker in daylight, less able to manifest. But you need to understand something. This won't stop. They'll keep coming for you, keep trying to pull you back, until either you give in or you find a way to break the connection." Wardell asked how to break it, and the farmer shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody who's figured it out has come back to tell the story. But I know this. Avoiding the coast won't help. Running won't help. The only thing that might work is confronting it directly, going back to the source, to the rest stop, and finding out what really happened there." He paused, looking at Wardell with eyes that had seen too much. "Find out if there's a way to release those people, to let them finally die. Because as long as they're trapped, as long as they're desperate, they'll keep reaching out. And eventually, they'll succeed in taking you." Wardell drove his damaged truck to a repair shop in Escanaba, where a mechanic looked at the bent trailer tandems and scraped landing gear and shook his head. "Lucky you didn't break an axle," the mechanic said. While the repairs were being done, Wardell sat in the waiting room and searched his phone for more information about the rest stop. This time, he found something buried deep in a local history forum. A post from 2011 by someone claiming to have been a state highway maintenance worker in 1979. The worker described being sent to the rest stop days before it was officially closed, tasked with removing equipment and supplies. "The place felt wrong," the post read. "Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. And there were sounds coming from the walk-in freezer in the restaurant kitchen. Scratching sounds, like someone was locked inside. But when we opened it, there was nobody there. Just frost so thick it looked like ice sculptures, and a smell like winter and deep water. The worker went on to describe finding items in the freezer that shouldn't have been there. Personal belongings, wallets, keys, pieces of clothing, all frozen solid and arranged in a deliberate pattern. It looked like someone had been trying to preserve something, the post continued, or trying to mark something. Wardell read the post 3 times, his mind racing. The freezer. Could that be where it started? Where the phenomenon was anchored? He searched for more information and found references to the site having been used for something else before the rest stop was built. An old ice house, where ice was harvested from Lake Superior in winter and stored for summer use. The pattern was becoming clearer. A location with a history of extreme cold and preservation. A building constructed on that site with a walk-in freezer. An unusual storm that brought unseasonable temperatures and thick mist. And 40 people who vanished without a trace, their belongings left behind. When his truck was repaired, Wardell made a decision. He wouldn't continue to Green Bay. He wouldn't run anymore. He would go back to the rest stop one final time and try to end this. His dispatcher called within the hour, demanding to know why he was going the wrong direction. Wardell didn't answer. He turned off his phone, unplugged his CB radio, and drove in silence back toward M28, back toward the coast, back toward the exit that had haunted him for weeks. The exit appeared in late afternoon. Wardell took it without hesitation, following the ramp down into the trees. The rest stop was there waiting, dark and abandoned. But this time Wardell wasn't there to explore or understand. He was there to end it. He parked his truck and walked toward the main building, and as he did he saw figures beginning to appear in the parking lot. The same people he'd seen before, watching him, following him, but they didn't approach. They just watched, as if curious about what he was doing. Wardell found the kitchen and the door to the walk-in freezer. It was frozen shut, but he found a pry bar and forced it open. Cold air rushed out, ancient and patient and aware. He stepped inside and found the frost sculptures the maintenance worker had described, and in the center of the space, arranged in a circle, were the belongings. 40 sets of them. Wallets and keys and watches and wedding rings, each one representing a person who'd been in the rest stop that night in 1979. In the very center was a metal box. Wardell pried it free from the ice and opened it, finding documents and a journal belonging to the rest stop's manager. The final entry was dated August 17, 1979, written in increasingly frantic handwriting. The temperature is dropping too fast. The systems can't keep up. The freezer is malfunctioning, running at temperatures that should be impossible. I can hear something in the freezer, a sound like wind or voices. And the door won't stay closed. It keeps opening on its own. And every time it does, the temperature drops further. I think something is wrong with this building. Something was here before we built the rest stop. Something that's been sleeping, and we've woken it up. Wardell heard the footsteps and turned to find a figure standing in the freezer doorway. It was one of the women from the parking lot, but now she looked more solid, more real. She was staring at the circle of belongings, and her expression was one of recognition and sorrow. "You understand now," she said, her voice clear. "We've been trying to tell someone for 45 years. We're not dead, we're trapped, held here by something that feeds on cold and time." Other figures appeared behind her, crowding into the freezer. "Can you help us?" the woman asked. "Can you find a way to break this? To let us finally move on?" Wardell looked at the circle of belongings, at the desperate faces surrounding him. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. The woman pointed at the circle. "Take them out. Break the pattern. It was created to keep us here, to anchor us to this moment. If you break it, maybe we can leave. Maybe we can finally die." Wardell began gathering the belongings, taking them out of their careful arrangement and placing them randomly around the freezer. As he worked, the temperature began to rise. The frost on the walls started to melt. The figures watched with growing excitement and fear, and as the last item was moved, as the circle was finally broken, they began to change. Their forms became less solid, more translucent. "It's working," the woman said, her voice fading. "We can feel it. The pull is weakening. We can move on now. We can finally—" She disappeared mid-sentence, dissolving into mist. The others followed, one by one, their faces showing relief and gratitude before they vanished. Within minutes, the freezer was empty except for Wardell and the scattered belongings. The cold was dissipating, the temperature normalizing. Wardell gathered the belongings into a bag and walked out of the building, back to his truck. The parking lot was empty now, no figures watching, no sense of presence. The rest stop felt truly abandoned for the first time. He drove back up to M28, and when he looked in his mirrors, the rest stop was fading, becoming less substantial. By the time he reached the highway, it had vanished completely. Just trees and an overgrown clearing where it had stood. He delivered the belongings to the Michigan State Police, telling them he'd found them while exploring. 3 days later, he received a call. The items matched missing persons cases from 1979, all people last seen near the old Lakeview rest stop. The cases would be officially closed, families notified. Wardell went back to driving, taking routes that included M28, no longer afraid. He never saw the rest stop again, never encountered the figures or heard the automated warning. But sometimes, on winter nights when the temperature drops and the mist rolls in from Superior, Wardell thinks about those 40 people, about how they spent 45 years trying to warn others, trying to find someone who would understand and help them. He wonders if they found peace when they were finally released. He hopes they did. And that memory stays with him, a reminder that the real horror isn't always death. Sometimes it's being trapped, unable to move forward or backward, stuck in an endless loop of the worst moment of your life. Wardell still drives truck, still hauls loads across the Upper Peninsula. But now, when he hears other drivers talking on the CB about strange experiences, he listens more carefully. Because he knows some of those stories are true, that there are places where reality becomes thin and the past bleeds through. And he knows that sometimes someone needs to step up and help, needs to break the circles that trap people, release the patterns that bind them. The highway stretches on, and Wardell drives it with open eyes, watching for signs, listening for warnings, ready to help if needed. Because if there was one place where time got broken, there might be others. And those people deserve to be freed. The mist still rises from Lake Superior on cold nights, still rolls across the coastal highways. But now, when Wardell drives through it, he doesn't see threats in every shadow. The supernatural has retreated, at least from this section of highway. But he knows it's still out there, somewhere, waiting in other forgotten places. And when that day comes, when he encounters it again, Wardell will be ready. Until then, he drives, mile after mile, through all the varied landscapes of the northern roads. And every time he passes where the rest stop used to be, he slows down, glances at the trees, and whispers thanks to the people who tried to warn him, even while desperately needing saving themselves. Their persistence across 45 years had ultimately led to their freedom.